Martha Ellison slammed her cast-iron pan down on that foreman's table so hard the coffee cups rattled and every cowboy in the room went dead silent. Her dress was patched. Her boots were split at the soles. Her hands were shaking from 3 weeks of walking across open plains with nothing but that pan and her dead mother's recipes folded inside her coat. "One dinner," she said. "That's all I'm asking. One dinner, and if your men don't scrape their bowls clean, I'll walk back out that gate before sunrise." Nobody in that room believed her. They should have. If this story already has you leaning forward, do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button and follow this channel, because this is the kind of story that gets better with every single part. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see just how far this story is traveling. And let's find out together what happens when the woman nobody wanted becomes the woman nobody can replace. The foreman laughed first. That was the thing Martha would remember longest. Not the cruelty of it, not the way the sound bounced off the wooden walls of the Silver Creek Ranch office and filled up every corner of the room, but the fact that it was so fast. She hadn't even finished her sentence. She had barely gotten the words out. "I'm looking for work as a cook." And Caleb Thornton was already laughing, already leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed over his chest, already looking over his shoulder at the two ranch hands standing near the door like he was sharing the best joke he'd heard all year. "A cook," he said, drawing the word out slow, letting it sit in the air between them. "You're here about the cook position." "Yes, sir," Martha said. "I am." He looked her over then, took his time about it, started at her boots, cracked leather, split at the left heel, caked with 3 weeks' worth of Montana dust, and worked his way up. Past the faded brown dress with the patched sleeves, past the cloth bag hanging from her right hand and the cast-iron pan gripped in her left, past her heavy frame, her wide shoulders, the fullness of her body that she had spent 35 years learning to carry with something resembling dignity. He looked at all of it, every inch of her, the way a man examines a horse he's already decided he doesn't want, and then he looked at her face. "Ma'am," he said, and there was still laughter sitting just underneath the word. "Most people who come through that gate looking for work can barely manage to feed themselves." The two ranch hands behind him snickered. Martha did not look away. She had promised herself that morning, standing at the edge of the ranch property, with her legs burning and her feet bleeding inside those ruined boots, that she would not look away from whatever came next. She had looked away too many times in her life. She was done with it. "I've been feeding working men since I was 14 years old," she said. "Cattle trail kitchens, mining camp mess halls, boarding houses along the Missouri River. I've cooked for 20 men and I've cooked for 200. I know how to stretch supplies and I know how to make a meal that keeps men on their feet for 14 hours. She paused. "I also know this ranch has been through 3 cooks in the last 4 months, which tells me whatever problem you've got in that kitchen isn't something an ordinary cook is going to fix." The laughter stopped. Caleb Thornton's expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough to tell her she had landed somewhere close to true. "Where'd you hear that?" he asked. "Millerton," she said. "General store." The woman behind the counter said Silver Creek Ranch was the hardest posting in the county and that the owner was getting desperate. She straightened her shoulders. "I'm not here because I'm desperate, Mr. Thornton. I'm here because I'm good at what I do, and I know a situation that needs someone good when I see one." He studied her for a long moment. Then the amusement came back into his face, slower this time, more deliberate. "You're good at what you do," he repeated. "Yes, sir. 40 ranch hands, 3 meals a day, 6 days a week, and Sunday supper. I've done worse. Kitchens half rotted out, pantries nearly empty. Budget's been cut down to nothing because the last cook was ordering supplies and selling half of them before they ever hit the shelf." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly at that. A cook stealing supplies. That was a particular kind of rot, the kind that started small and spread through an operation before anyone noticed. She filed it away. "Then I'll work with what's there," she said. Caleb Thornton leaned forward and put his elbows on the desk. He looked at her like a man who has already made up his mind and is just waiting for the formality of the conversation to be over. "I appreciate your confidence, ma'am," he said, and his voice had gone almost kind, which was somehow worse than the laughter. "But this isn't a boarding house. These aren't travelers who'll eat whatever's put in front of them and move on. These are working cowboys who've been eating bad food for 4 months, and they're mean about it. They're not going to be patient with someone who's still learning. They're not going to be gentle. He glanced at her body again, quick and dismissive. And this is hard work, physical work. It's not something that— "One dinner," Martha said. He stopped. "I'm sorry? Give me one dinner." She set the cloth bag down on the floor beside her feet and held the cast iron pan a little tighter. "Tonight, whatever's in that pantry, whatever supplies you've got, I'll cook dinner for your men. All 40 of them. And if they don't scrape their bowls clean and ask for more, I'll walk out before sunrise and you'll never see me again." She met his eyes. "But if they do, you give me the position. Fair wages, a roof over my head, and you stop looking at me like I wandered in off the charity wagon." The 2 ranch hands by the door had gone quiet. One of them, young, maybe 20, with a sunburned neck and surprised eyes, was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Caleb Thornton was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned back again and spread his hands. "Lady," he said, "you're either the most confident cook who ever walked into this office or the most foolish one. I genuinely cannot tell which." "Let dinner answer that question," Martha said. He stared at her. She stared back. Outside, somewhere across the yard, a horse shifted in its stall and the sound of boots on the porch boards drifted through the closed door. The afternoon light coming through the single window was turning gold. "Fine," Caleb Thornton said at last. He didn't sound convinced. He sounded like a man humoring someone he expected to fail. "Kitchen's out back. Pantry keys on the hook by the door. You've got until sundown." Martha picked up her cloth bag. She nodded once, the way her mother had taught her, chin level, eyes steady, no unnecessary words once the deal was struck. She was halfway to the door when his voice came after her. "For what it's worth," he said, and there was something that might have been genuine in it, buried under the skepticism. "I hope you can cook. These men could use a decent meal." She didn't turn around. "They'll get one," she said, and walked out into the Montana afternoon. She found the kitchen at the back of the main house, connected to it by a narrow covered walkway that rattled when the wind came through. The door stuck when she pushed it, swollen in the frame from rain that had gotten in through a gap in the roof, and she had to put her shoulder against it and push hard before it gave. The smell that hit her first was dust and old grease and something sour underneath, the smell of a space that had been used carelessly and then abandoned. She stood in the doorway for a moment and let her eyes move through the room. It was not the worst kitchen she had ever worked in. It was close. The stove was large, a good cast iron range that someone had let go without proper cleaning. But she could see from across the room that the iron itself was sound. The work table in the center was scarred and stained but solid. The shelves along the far wall held a scattering of pots and pans, some of them mismatched, some of them missing handles, but enough to work with. The problem was the pantry. She crossed to it and pulled the door open with the key Caleb had mentioned, hanging right where he said, which told her at least the foreman was an organized man, even if the kitchen wasn't, and looked at what she had to work with. Flour. Not much, but some. A sack of dried beans pushed into the back corner. A tin of lard. Some salt. A small supply of dried herbs that someone had hung years ago and never touched. She lifted a bundle and rubbed it between her fingers and was surprised to find there was still something left in it, a faint ghost of sage and something sharper underneath. 3 large onions going soft at the edges, but not rotten. Half a crate of potatoes. And in the cold box at the end of the pantry, enough beef to make something real with. A cut that wasn't prime, but wasn't ruined either. Tough and lean and requiring patience. She stood there for the moment with her hand resting on the cold box and thought about what her mother used to say. "Martha girl, anybody can cook when the pantry's full. The ones worth knowing are the ones who can look at almost nothing and still see supper." She closed the cold box and went back into the kitchen and started a fire in the stove. The young ranch hand she'd noticed in the office found her about an hour later. She heard him before she saw him. Hesitant boots on the walkway, a pause at the door, the particular silence of someone trying to decide whether to knock. She didn't look up from the beef she was cutting. "You can come in," she said. He came in. I was younger up close than he'd looked in the office. Maybe 19, maybe not even that, with a face that was still more boy than man under the weathering. He stood just inside the door with his hat in his hands and watched her work with an expression she recognized. Not mockery. Something closer to wonder. "Thomas Reed," he said. I was going to check if you needed anything. Do you have access to the supply shed?" He blinked. "Yes, ma'am. Is there anything in it? Wood herbs, dried peppers, anything set aside from last season?" He thought about it. "There might be some dried chilies. And I think there's a tin of molasses somebody left." Martha stopped cutting and looked at him directly for the first time. "Molasses?" "Yes, ma'am." "Go get it," she said. "Both things, if you can find them." He went. She watched him go and then went back to her work, her knife moving steady and sure through the tough beef, breaking it down into pieces small enough to cook low and slow in the time she had. She was already calculating in her head. Beef stew with the beans and the potatoes, the onions going in early to build the base, the dried herbs and chilies to put some heat in it, the molasses at the end for depth. She'd make the bread with what flour she had. Simple, no rise time to waste. The kind her mother called hardship bread that somehow always tasted like something more than its ingredients. And the potatoes, seasoned right, roasted in the lard until they had some color on them. It wasn't a feast, but it was going to be a meal, a real one, the kind that reminded men what it felt like to be fed instead of just filled. Thomas came back with the molasses and a small bundle of dried chilies and set them on the work table. He lingered. "You've been doing this a long time," he said. It wasn't a question. Martha glanced at her hands without stopping her work. The scars there were old, burn marks from years beside hot iron stoves, calluses layered on calluses, the particular roughness that came from a life spent working with heat and blades and weight. She knew what her hands looked like. She had stopped being self-conscious about them somewhere around the age of 22. "Long enough," she said. "Where'd you work before here?" "Cattle trail camps, mostly, some mining towns, a boarding house in Billings for 3 years before the owner sold it." She paused. "Before that, my mother's kitchen. She was the one who actually knew what she was doing. I just followed her around asking questions until enough of it stuck." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mr. Thornton's going to say it isn't going to work. Even if dinner's good, he's going to find a reason." Martha set down her knife and looked at him. "Why are you telling me that?" He shifted his weight, turning his hat in his hands. "Because I've seen it before. 3 cooks in 4 months. The last one was a man, and he was a decent cook, and Caleb still found a way to run him off inside 6 weeks." He hesitated. "I don't think it's about the cooking. I think there's something else wrong with this ranch that nobody wants to talk about." Martha looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked her knife back up. "One thing at a time," she said. "Tonight I cook dinner. Tomorrow we see what tomorrow brings." She glanced at him sideways. "You want to be useful? Keep that fire stoked. I need the stove hot, and I need it staying hot." He put his hat back on his head. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went to the woodpile. She had been cooking for 2 hours when she heard boots on the porch outside the kitchen door. Not one set, several. She didn't look up. She had learned a long time ago that the best response to an audience was no response at all. Let the food do the talking. The door opened, and Caleb Thornton leaned in. He had 2 other men behind him, older hands by the look of them, the kind of weathered faces that had seen enough to be suspicious of most things. "How long?" Caleb asked. "Another hour," Martha said without looking up. "Maybe less." "What are you making?" "Beef stew, bread, roasted potatoes." One of the men behind him made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Beef stew," he said. "Everybody makes beef stew." "Not like this," Thomas said from the corner by the woodpile, and then looked immediately like he regretted saying it. Caleb glanced at Thomas with something between amusement and irritation, and then looked back at Martha. He was trying to read her, she could feel it, trying to find the crack in her certainty. The place where the confidence gave way to something shakier. She gave him nothing to work with. "An hour," he said. "Yes, sir." He left. The other two men lingered a moment longer, and one of them, the one who had laughed at the beef stew comment, leaned in close enough that she could smell tobacco on him. "Word of advice," he said quietly. "Men here been eating bad for a long time. Their tempers are short. If that stew is ordinary, you'd best be gone before they finish their first bowls." Martha lifted her eyes to his. "Then I'd better make sure it isn't ordinary," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then straightened up and walked out. Thomas exhaled from the corner. "That's Hector Briggs," he said. "He's been here 12 years. He doesn't like anybody." "He gave me useful information," Martha said. "That's enough." She went back to the stew. The smell coming off it now was something different. The molasses had gone in 20 minutes ago, and it had done what she hoped, deepened the broth from something thin into something that filled the whole kitchen, rich and dark, and carrying that edge of heat from the dried chilies underneath. The bread was in the oven, simple and plain, but she had rubbed the top with lard before it went in, and it was going to come out with a crust that crackled when you broke it. The potatoes were in the pan on the edge of the stove, turning golden in the fat, and she had hit them with the last of the sage and salt when they started to color. It wasn't magic. It was just knowing. Knowing what went in first and what went in last. Knowing when to leave something alone and when to push it. Knowing that hunger is a language and that food, made right, is the answer to things people can't say out loud. Her mother had taught her that. She stood in that half-rotted kitchen with her aching feet and her cracked boots and her faded dress and the lifetime of judgment she had carried in her body since she was old enough to understand what the looks from strangers meant. And she cooked. She cooked like it mattered. Because it did. When Thomas rang the bell for supper, a rusted iron bell hanging from a hook on the post outside the kitchen door, she heard the response from across the yard. Boots on dirt. Voices lowering from the easy loud talk of men cutting loose at the end of the day into something quieter as they got close, and the smell hit them. She watched through the open kitchen window as 40 cowboys came toward the mess hall in the falling dusk, and she watched the moment when the smell reached the ones in front. Watched the way they slowed without meaning to, the way heads came up, the way conversation dropped. She didn't watch them eat. She went back into the kitchen and started cleaning up, because that was also something her mother had taught her. A clean kitchen was a working kitchen, and a working kitchen didn't wait. But she heard it. She heard the silence that fell over the mess hall after the first few minutes. The particular silence of men who have stopped talking because they are eating instead, really eating, not shoveling food in out of necessity, but tasting it, noticing it, following the flavor somewhere. She heard Thomas moving through the tables, refilling the bread baskets, and she heard the low rumble of voices asking for more, not demanding, not the sharp, impatient voices of men with grievances, but something softer than that, something almost careful, like men who had been given something unexpected and weren't sure yet how to respond to it. She heard Hector Briggs say, in a voice that carried despite himself, "What in the hell is in this?" She allowed herself a very small smile. Then she went back to scrubbing the stove. She was still cleaning when Caleb Thornton came into the kitchen. She heard him come in, heard the particular deliberateness of his boots on the floor, the pause just inside the door, and she kept working. She had the stove half cleaned and the work table cleared and the bread pan soaking in the wash basin, and she was not going to stop just because he was standing there. "The men are asking for the cook," he said. "The cook is cleaning up," she said. A pause. "Martha." It was the first time he had used her name. She noticed. They scraped their bowls. She set down the rag she'd been using on the stove and turned around to face him. His expression was something she had not expected to see on Caleb Thornton's face. It wasn't quite contrition. He wasn't a man who came to contrition easily. She could already see that. But it was something adjacent to it. An acknowledgement of something he had gotten wrong. "Every single one of them," he said. "Hector Briggs asked for thirds. Hector Briggs has never asked for seconds at this ranch in 12 years. He paused. "How did you do it?" "The pantry was nearly empty." "The pantry had what I needed," she said. "That's not an answer." It's the only one that matters. She picked up the rag again and turned back to the stove. Do I have the position, Mr. Thornton? I was quiet for long enough that she thought he might still say no. Might find the thing he'd been looking for earlier, the crack, the reason to send her on her way, and use it. Fair wages, he said at last. Room in the small house at the back of the property. 3 meals a day, 6 days, Sunday supper. And I'll talk to Mr. Carter about the kitchen. It needs work, and I'll get someone on the repairs. She nodded. And you'll stop looking at me like I'm a problem you didn't ask for? She said. Another pause. Longer this time. I'll do my best, he said, and the honesty in it was more than she had expected from him. She turned around again and looked at him steadily. That's all any of us can do, she said. He left. She turned back to the stove and finished cleaning it, every inch of it, until the iron was as clean as she could get it with what she had. Outside, the voices in the mess hall had risen again. The easy, loose talk of men who had eaten well and were feeling something close to content. She could hear Thomas's voice among them, and Hector Briggs's low rumble, and the occasional burst of laughter that had nothing sharp in it. She wrung out the cleaning rag and hung it over the edge of the wash basin. Her feet were screaming. Her back ached with the specific deep pull of hours on her feet after weeks of walking. Her hands were raw from the heat and the cleaning water. The small house at the back of the property was going to be whatever it was, probably drafty, probably rough. And she was going to fall asleep in it tonight the way a stone falls into water. But she had a position, she had a kitchen, she had 40 men who had scraped their bowls clean. Martha Ellison picked up her cast iron pan from the corner where she had set it when she came in, and she carried it with her as she walked out into the Montana night. The stars over Silver Creek Ranch were enormous and cold and very beautiful. She stood in the yard for a moment and looked up at them and thought about her mother, the way she always did at the end of a hard day, carrying her mother's voice in her chest like a coal that never quite went out. Show them what your hands can do, Martha girl. That's the only argument worth making. She had made it. She would keep making it. Whatever came next. The small house at the back of the Silver Creek Ranch property was exactly what Martha had expected. The door hung crooked in its frame. The single window had a crack running diagonal across the lower pane, patched with oilcloth that had been there long enough to yellow at the edges. The iron bed frame had no mattress, just the frame itself and a folded horse blanket that smelled of dust and old leather. There was a wooden chair, a small table, a hook on the wall for hanging clothes, and nothing else. Martha set her cloth bag on the table and her cast iron pan on the floor beside the bed and sat down on the edge of the iron frame and let the silence of the room settle around her. Her feet hurt so badly that taking her boots off felt like a physical risk. Like the moment she stopped ignoring the pain, it would become something she couldn't push back down. She took them off anyway. She always did. Her mother had taught her that pretending something wasn't there didn't make it gone. It just made you worse at dealing with it when it finally demanded attention. She peeled her socks off and looked at her feet in the dim light coming through the oilcloth-patched window and made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something else entirely. She had walked 3 weeks across open Montana terrain in boots that weren't fit for 3 days of it. She had arrived at a ranch where the foreman laughed in her face and the hands sized her up and found her wanting before she opened her mouth. She had cooked a meal in a half-rotten kitchen with a near-empty pantry for 40 hungry, resentful men. And she had the position. She lay back on the iron frame and pulled the horse blanket over herself and was asleep before the stars outside had moved very far across the sky. She was up before dawn, not because she had to be. Caleb hadn't given her a start time, and she suspected the ranch had been running on a loose schedule since the last cook left, but because she had always been up before dawn. Her body had made that decision years ago and stopped consulting her about it. She washed her face with water from the small pitcher someone had left on the table. Thomas, she guessed, because the gesture had that particular quality of quiet thoughtfulness she had already noticed in him, and laced her boots as tight as they would go, and walked across the yard to the kitchen in the dark. The fire she had banked the night before was still holding a low heat in the stove. She fed it until it was running strong, and then started breakfast. The first man who came through the mess hall door that morning stopped so short when he smelled the food that the man behind him walked into his back. "Watch it, Davis." "Something's different," Davis said. "What?" Davis didn't answer. He just stood there with his nose in the air like a dog that's caught a scent it wasn't expecting. Then he walked to the long table and sat down, and when Thomas brought his plate out, eggs cooked in the lard with some of the onion Martha had saved from the night before, bread with a crust that still had some crackle to it even reheated, and a small dish of seasoned beans. He ate every bite of it without once complaining. Which was, Thomas told Martha later, the first time in 4 months that Davis had eaten breakfast without complaining. By mid-morning, something had shifted in the yard. Martha felt it more than she saw it. The way the men moved past the kitchen door had changed. The previous cooks had apparently kept the kitchen closed during working hours, a policy Martha had no intention of maintaining, and when she propped the door open to let out some of the heat from the stove, she noticed that the men who passed by slowed down. Not stopping, they had work to do and she wasn't interested in becoming a spectacle, but slowing, glancing in. One of them, a large man with a red beard that she would later learn was called Big Jim, actually stopped at the doorway and said, without any preamble, "What's that smell?" "Lunch," Martha said. "Couple more hours." Big Jim looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. "What are you making?" "Bean soup with cornbread. And I found some dried apple in the back of the pantry, so there'll be a cobbler if I can get the sugar situation sorted out." Big Jim was quiet for a moment. "We ain't had cobbler since before the last cook left," he said. "Well," Martha said, "you're going to have it today." He stood in the doorway for another moment like he was waiting for the catch. When there wasn't one, he nodded once, a small, careful nod, and walked on. Martha watched him go, and then went back to her cornbread batter and did not allow herself to smile until she was sure nobody could see her. Caleb Thornton came to the kitchen at mid-morning and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and watched her work for a while without saying anything. She had learned the night before that this was a habit of his. He was a man who processed information through watching, who let things settle before he spoke. She had worked for men like that before. She knew to let them watch. "Hector asked me this morning if the new cook was staying," he said finally. Martha didn't look up from the cornbread. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that depended on whether she kept cooking like she did last night." A pause. "He said that was an acceptable arrangement." "High praise from Hector Briggs," Martha said. "You have no idea," Caleb said. He was quiet again for a moment. "The kitchen needs work. I told Mr. Carter last night. He said he'd send someone to look at the roof and the door this week." "The stove grate on the left side is cracked," Martha said. "It's not urgent, but it will be by winter, and the cold box needs resealing. I'm losing temperature faster than I should, and it'll matter when the weather turns." Caleb's eyebrows went up a fraction. "You noticed all that last night?" "I notice what I need to notice," she said. "I made a list." She nodded toward the work table without looking up. "It's there, if Mr. Carter wants to see it." He crossed to the table and picked up the folded paper she'd written on before dawn. Her mother's habit, writing things down, because a thing not written was a thing too easily forgotten. He read it. He was quiet in a different way than before. The watching and waiting quiet had shifted into something that might have been surprise. "This is thorough," he said. "I intend to run this kitchen properly," Martha said. "That means knowing what it needs." She poured the cornbread batter into the pan and moved it toward the oven. "The supply situation also needs addressing. What I found in that pantry last night, it wasn't just low, it was wrong. The quantities were wrong. Someone had been ordering and not delivering, or delivering and not storing." She paused. "Or storing somewhere other than the kitchen pantry." Caleb set the list down. She felt the change in the room, the temperature of it, the particular stillness that settles when something said out loud can't be unsaid. "That's a serious thing to suggest," he said. "I'm not suggesting anything," Martha said carefully. "I'm telling you what I observed. The supply records, if you have them, would tell the rest of the story." She finally looked up and met his eyes. "I'm a cook, Mr. Thornton. I'm not accusing anyone. But if I'm going to feed 40 men properly on whatever budget this ranch has, I need to know whether that budget is actually making it to the pantry. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he picked the list back up and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll look into it," he said. He left. Martha turned back to the stove and checked the cobbler and thought about what Thomas had said the night before. "I think there's something else wrong with this ranch that nobody wants to talk about," and filed it beside the supply observation in the back of her mind, where she kept things that weren't ready to be spoken yet. Lunch was louder than dinner had been. The silence of the night before had been the silence of surprise. Men, too, caught off guard by what they were tasting to remember to talk. But at lunch, the surprise had worn off enough that they were eating and talking at the same time, which was a different kind of life in a mess hall. The comfortable noise of men who were no longer bracing against their food. Martha could hear it from the kitchen, and it settled something in her chest that had been held tight since she walked through the ranch gate. Big Jim ate 2 bowls of the bean soup and 3 pieces of cornbread, and then, apparently as an afterthought, came to the kitchen door. "Cobbler any good?" he asked. "Better than good," Thomas said from behind Martha, and she gave him a look, and he went back to the dishes without another word. "It's ready when you want it," Martha told Big Jim. I went and got 2 portions and ate them both at the table without getting up, which Thomas reported to her later, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had made a correct prediction and was very pleased about it. It was mid-afternoon, the kitchen quiet, Martha working through the prep for supper with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that the planning and the execution happened simultaneously, when she heard the sound from outside the main house that made her set her knife down. Voices. 2 of them. One she recognized as Caleb Thornton's even through the walls, low and controlled, the voice of a man keeping himself in check. The other she didn't know, louder. The confident loud of a man who was accustomed to being the loudest person in a room and had stopped noticing it. She went back to her knife. It wasn't her business. Then she heard a third voice, quieter than both of them, with a quality she couldn't identify from a distance. And Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that made her set the knife down again. "Mr. Carter's back," Thomas said. Martha looked at him. "He was away?" "Went to Miles City 2 days ago. Business with the bank." Thomas glanced back over his shoulder. "He doesn't usually come back in a mood." "What kind of mood is he in?" "A careful one." Thomas hesitated. "There's a man with him, Edward Whitmore. He owns the land to the north and east of Silver Creek. He's been wanting this ranch for 2 years. He dropped his voice. "The water rights mostly. Silver Creek runs through this property on the way to Whitmore's grazing land, and whoever owns this property controls the water supply for half the county." Martha absorbed this. She looked at the work table. She looked at her knife. She looked back at Thomas. "Go do your work," she said. He went. She picked up the knife and went back to her prep and thought about water rights and about a man named Whitmore who had been wanting Silver Creek Ranch for 2 years, and about a supply ledger with numbers that didn't match, and about 3 cooks gone in 4 months, and she added them all together in the careful back part of her mind and didn't like the sum she got. She saw William Carter for the first time that evening. He came to the kitchen door just before supper service. She had heard the other man, Whitmore, leave an hour before, the sound of a horse and buggy on the ranch road, and he stood in the doorway in a way that was entirely different from how Caleb Thornton stood in it. Caleb stood in doorways like a man who was making a decision. William Carter stood in this one like a man who hadn't decided yet whether he was intruding. How was in his early 40s, lean in the way of men who worked their own land and didn't stop for long enough to put on weight. His face was weathered and careful and tired in a way that went deeper than the day. The tiredness of a man who had been managing something heavy for a long time and had gotten used to doing it mostly alone. He looked at her directly, which she appreciated. Not the looking over that Caleb had done, the inventory of her body and her clothes and what they implied. Just direct. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Caleb tells me you cooked last night." "I did." He said it was the best meal the men have had at this ranch in longer than he could remember. He paused. He also said you gave him a list of kitchen repairs and a question about the supply records that he didn't know how to answer. Martha kept working. I gave him what I observed. The rest was his to do with as he thought right. William Carter was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her in that direct way, and she could feel him assembling something, the way she had felt Caleb assembling things in the office the day before. But this felt different, less like evaluation, more like recognition. The previous cook, he said. The one before last. He left because Caleb let him go. The one before him left because the men made his life difficult enough that he decided to move on. And the one before that, he stopped. The one before that left overnight. No notice, no explanation, just gone. And the supply records show gaps that start around the time the last cook arrived, Martha said. He looked at her sharply. Caleb told me he was going to look into it, she said. I'm not ahead of where I should be, Mr. Carter. I just observe what's there. What else do you observe? He asked. His voice had changed, not unfriendly, but more careful, like a man who has decided something is real and is adjusting accordingly. Martha considered the question. She set down the knife and turned to face him properly for the first time in the conversation. I observe that this is a good ranch with good men who have been eating badly for months and are angrier about it than they realize, she said. I observe that the kitchen has been allowed to fall apart in ways that a working ranch can't afford. I observe that someone has been, she chose the word carefully, inconsistent with the supply orders, and that the inconsistency has cost this ranch money it can't afford to lose. She paused. And I observe that you've had a difficult afternoon, and that whatever Mr. Whitmore said to you in there is sitting on you right now like a stone. William Carter stared at her. She picked up her knife. Supper will be ready in 45 minutes, she said. I made a roast. It's not fancy, but it'll be good. He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then, thank you, Mrs. Ellison. Martha, she said. Mrs. Ellison was my mother-in-law, and we didn't particularly get along. She heard something that might, in different circumstances, have become a laugh, a small sound, quickly contained, and then his boots on the walkway, and then nothing. She made the roast the way her mother had taught her, low heat, long time, with the pan drippings used to make a gravy that was mostly patience and a little bit of salt. She made roasted carrots with the last of the sage and some dried rosemary she'd found in the pantry behind a tin that hadn't been moved in what looked like years. She made a simple pan biscuit to go alongside. It was not elaborate, but when the men came in for supper that evening, the room went quiet again in the same way it had the night before. That particular held-breath quality of hunger meeting something that actually answers it. And then the sound built back up into talk, real talk. The loose, warm talk of men who were comfortable enough to stop guarding themselves. Hector Briggs, sitting at the far end of the long table, looked up once toward the kitchen door. Martha happened to be looking out. Their eyes met. He looked away first. But before he did, he gave the smallest, most reluctant nod she had ever seen. She accepted it. Thomas cleared the tables that evening, while Martha finished cleaning the kitchen, and when the last pan was put away and the fire banked for the night, she sat down for the first time since before dawn on the wooden stool in the corner of the kitchen and let herself be still for a moment. Her second full day at Silver Creek Ranch. She had a position. She had a kitchen. She had men who were eating properly for the first time in months, and she had an uncomfortable collection of facts stacking up in the back of her mind that she was not yet ready to look at directly. A man named Whitmore who wanted the ranch, supply numbers that didn't add up, 3 cooks gone in 4 months, and a ranch owner who came home from a bank meeting looking like a man who had just been told how far the ground was beneath him. She sat on the stool and listened to the night sounds outside. Horses in the stable, wind through the Montana grass, the far-off sound of an owl, and thought about her mother and about what her mother would have said. When something smells wrong, Martha girl, it is wrong. Don't wait until you can prove it. Start watching sooner. She was watching. The third day brought the first real trouble. It started small enough that someone less attentive might have missed it entirely. Martha was doing the morning supply inventory, a task she had assigned herself from the first day, because knowing exactly what she had at all times was the difference between a kitchen that ran and a kitchen that failed. And she noticed that the flour sack she had measured carefully the morning before was lighter than it should have been. Not dramatically lighter, not empty, just less. Enough less to matter if you were planning a week's worth of bread, which she was. She stood in the pantry doorway and looked at the flour sack and thought about it. Then she thought about the number of people who had access to the kitchen. Then she went and found Thomas. "Who comes into this kitchen when I'm not in it?" she asked. Thomas looked up from the task she'd interrupted. He'd been mending a piece of leather tack on the bench outside the stable door, his hands still holding the needle. "Besides the mess hands?" "The mess hands answer to me," Martha said. "Who else?" He thought about it. The careful thinking of someone who was being precise about it, not evasive. She appreciated that about him. Thomas Reed thought before he spoke in a way that was rarer than it should have been. "Caleb comes through sometimes. Mr. Carter, occasionally, when he wants coffee in the evening." He paused. "And Reeves." "Who is Reeves?" "Dale Reeves. He handled the supply orders before you came. When there was a cook, he'd bring the orders from town. When there wasn't, he'd manage the pantry." Another pause. "He was also friends with the last cook, the one who left overnight." Martha looked at Thomas steadily. "Is he still handling supply orders?" "Caleb told him you'd be managing the orders now," Thomas said. "Reeves didn't like that." "I imagine he didn't," Martha said. She went back into the kitchen and made a second note on the piece of paper in her dress pocket, the same pocket where she kept her mother's recipes, folded small. And then she went back to making breakfast and said nothing more about it. But she started locking the pantry when she left the kitchen. She found the key on its hook by the door, the same hook where Caleb had told her it was on the first day, and she began carrying it with her instead of leaving it on the hook. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that might be noticed or might not be. It was noticed. Dale Reeves found her that afternoon on the walkway between the kitchen and the main house. She had been heading to speak to Caleb about the week's supply order, her first, the one she had been building in her head since the morning she looked at the near-empty pantry, and Reeves appeared from around the corner of the house with the particular quality of someone who had been waiting. How was a lean man in his late 30s, with a face like worked leather and pale eyes that moved too quickly, cataloging everything without settling on anything. He had the kind of smile that appeared on the face, but didn't change the rest of it. "You must be the new cook," he said. "I am," Martha said. She didn't stop walking. He fell into step beside her. "Reeves. Dale Reeves. I used to handle the supply orders for the kitchen." "I know who you are," Martha said. A small silence. Then, "I heard you're taking over the orders." "That's correct." "Right." He was quiet for a moment, keeping her pace. "I just want you to know, if you need help navigating the suppliers in town, I know all the men. I know what they charge and what they'll charge and how to work a price down. It's not simple if you don't already have the relationships." Martha stopped walking. She turned and looked at him directly, the way she had looked at Caleb Thornton in the office on the first day. Steady, not hostile, just clear. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "I appreciate the offer. I've been managing supply orders for working kitchens since I was 20 years old, and I've built relationships with suppliers in 6 counties across 3 territories. I'll be fine." She paused. "But if there's something specific you wanted to say to me, I'd rather you said it plainly." Something moved behind those pale eyes. Quick. Gone before she could name it. "Nothing specific," he said. "Just being neighborly." "Of course," she said. She turned back in the direction she'd been going. "Good day, Mr. Reeves." She felt him watching her as she walked away. The feeling of it sat between her shoulder blades like a hand pressing, and she walked steadily, and didn't hurry, and didn't look back. She found Caleb in this ranch office, and laid out her supply order on his desk. Itemized, priced against what she'd been able to confirm from the records in the kitchen, organized by priority. He looked at it for a long time. "This is different from what Reeves used to order," he said. "I imagine it is," Martha said. "The quantities are calibrated for 40 men, 3 meals a day. The previous orders, She chose her words. The previous orders were calibrated for something else. Caleb looked up from the paper. "Martha," he said, "what are you saying?" "I'm saying that based on the records I've found in the kitchen and the quantities currently in the pantry, there's a gap of approximately 4 to 6 months of supply orders that don't correspond to the supplies that are actually there." She kept her voice level. "Someone has been ordering supplies that the kitchen never received, or receiving supplies that were never put in the kitchen. Either way, the money left this ranch and the food didn't arrive." The room was very quiet. "How much money?" Caleb asked. "I'd need to see the ledger, the full one, not just the kitchen records." She held his gaze. "But based on what I can estimate from the kitchen records alone, I'd say Mr. Carter has been losing somewhere between $30 and $50 a month for at least 4 months. Caleb put both hands flat on the desk. He was very still in the way that men go still when something they suspected but didn't want to confirm has just been confirmed. "That's $150 to $200, he said. It came out quiet. "Yes," Martha said. He was quiet for a long time. "I need to talk to Mr. Carter," he said. "I know," Martha said. "I'll be in the kitchen." She was in the kitchen, starting supper, because supper had to be started regardless of what was happening in the ranch office, when she heard the raised voices from across the yard. Not the loud, confident voice of Edward Whitmore this time. Different voices. She kept working. She kept her knife moving and her mind on the food, and let whatever was happening across the yard happen without her. Thomas came in 20 minutes later with wide eyes and a controlled expression that told her he was working hard at not showing how unsettled he was. "Reeves is gone," he said. Martha didn't look up. "Gone how?" "Gone as in Caleb found the discrepancy in the main ledger and confronted him, and Reeves said 2 sentences and walked off the property." Thomas paused. "He didn't even go get his gear from the bunkhouse, just walked." A man who walked away from his gear was a man who knew better than to stay. Martha set her knife down and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is Mr. Carter all right?" Thomas thought about it. "He's quiet. He and Caleb are in the office. I think he's looking at the ledger." He hesitated. "Martha, that money, $200, maybe more. That's a serious loss for a ranch that's already running lean." "I know," she said. "It might have been enough to—" He stopped himself, started again. "Whitmore has been offering to buy, and Mr. Carter has been saying no. But if the ranch is in worse financial trouble than he knew, then Whitmore's offer looks a lot more reasonable than it did before," Martha said quietly. Thomas nodded. His young face was troubled. Martha looked at the stove. She looked at the food she was preparing. She looked at her hands, scarred and rough and capable, and thought about what it meant to lose something you had built, to find out it had been hollowed out from inside by someone you trusted. "Make sure there's enough bread tonight," she said, "and tell Big Jim there's pie." Thomas blinked. "Pie? I found a tin of preserves at the very back of the pantry that someone put there and forgot about. It's peach. It'll make a pie." She picked up the knife again. "A man who's had a bad day eats better when he knows there's something good at the end of supper. Go tell Jim." Thomas went. Martha turned back to the stove. Outside, across the yard, the light in the ranch office window was burning steady, and she could imagine the 2 men inside it, the foreman and the owner, sitting with a ledger between them and looking at the shape of what had been done to them. That particular kind of damage. The kind that was worse because it came from inside. She had seen that kind of thing before. She had survived that kind of thing before. In kitchens and boarding houses and camp mess halls, she had watched men and women discover that something they trusted had been quietly working against them, and she had watched what happened next. Sometimes they folded. Sometimes they got angry in ways that didn't help anyone. And sometimes, in the best cases, they got still and clear and decided what they were going to do about it. She didn't know yet which kind of man William Carter was. But she thought, based on the way he had stood in the kitchen doorway the evening before, direct, quiet, tired, but not defeated, she thought he might be the third kind. She made the pie. She made the roast chicken and the seasoned greens and the bread she had promised and the simple gravy that went with the chicken. And when Thomas rang the bell and the men came in, she listened to the sound of Silver Creek Ranch filling up with the noise of 40 men who were eating a good meal and didn't know yet what had happened in the office that afternoon. They would find out tomorrow. Things like that always got out. She had learned that in 6 counties across 3 territories. But tonight they ate well, and the sound of it, the clatter and talk and occasional laughter, carried through the kitchen door and settled around Martha like something warm. And she stood at the stove and listened to it and let herself feel, just for a moment, what it was like to be somewhere she was needed. Not just wanted, needed. It was a difference she had spent most of her life learning how to find. William Carter came to this kitchen door late that evening. The mess hall was empty and cleaned. Thomas long gone to the bunkhouse, the fire in the stove banked low. Martha was finishing the last of the tidying. She always finished the last of the tidying herself, because there was something about an orderly kitchen at the end of the day that settled her in a way she couldn't fully explain. He stood in the doorway, and she heard him before she saw him, and she turned around and looked at his face and saw what Thomas had described, the quiet. But it wasn't defeated quiet. It was the quiet of a man who had sat with something painful and come out the other side of it with some decision intact. "Caleb told me you found it first," he said. "The supply problem." "I noticed it," Martha said. "Caleb did the work. He says you told him where to look." William's hands were at his sides. "I want you to know, the full amount missing, once we added it up properly. It was more than the 200 estimate, significantly more." He paused. "It explains a lot. Why this ranch has been struggling. Why the men have been unhappy. Why I've been—" He stopped. "Why Whitmore's offer kept looking more reasonable than it should have," Martha said. William looked at her. Something moved across his face. Surprise, recognition, something else. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." He was quiet. "I'm not selling." "Good," Martha said. He looked at her. "That's all? Good?" "This is a good ranch," Martha said simply. "Good land, good men, good water." She turned back to wipe down the last of the work table. "It deserves to stay in the hands of someone who knows what it is. Good night, Mr. Carter." She heard him start to leave, then stop. "Martha," he said. She looked back. "Thank you," he said. It was plain. Just those 2 words, no decoration on them. The kind of thank you that meant what it said. She nodded once. He left. She finished wiping down the work table and hung up the cleaning cloth and checked the stove and stood for a moment in the kitchen that was starting, in the way that spaces do when someone cares for them consistently, to feel like hers. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and cold. Inside, the banked fire held its low heat. Martha Ellison blew out the lamp and walked back across the dark yard to the small crooked house at the back of the property. And for the first time since she had walked through the gate of Silver Creek Ranch, she did not feel like a woman who was waiting to be sent away. The morning after Reeves walked off the property, Silver Creek Ranch woke up different. Martha felt it the moment she crossed the yard in the dark before dawn. Something in the air that wasn't quite tension and wasn't quite relief, but sat somewhere uncomfortable between the two. The kind of atmosphere that settles over a place when something hidden has been dragged into the light, and everyone is still deciding how they feel about having been in the dark so long. She built the fire in the stove and started breakfast and said nothing about it. But the men talked. They always talked. Martha had learned in 20 years of feeding working men that a mess hall was the most honest room on any property, more honest than an office, more honest than a bunkhouse, because hunger made people real in a way that nothing else did. Men who were guarded all day long had a way of letting things slip over food, and the food she was putting in front of them now was good enough that they were letting their guards down faster than they probably realized. Big Jim said it first, which surprised nobody who knew him. He said it to the man next to him, but in the carrying voice of a man who has never in his life successfully whispered. "Reeves was skimming the kitchen money," Big Jim said. "That's why we've been eating garbage for 4 months. It wasn't the cook. It was Reeves stealing the supply money before it ever got to the pantry." The table went quiet. Then a man named Avery, A quiet hand who worked the eastern fence line and had barely said 10 words to Martha in 3 days, said, "How much?" "Enough," Big Jim said. Another silence. Longer. "I wondered," said Hector Briggs from the far end. He said it to his plate, not to the room, but in the quiet everyone heard it. "I wondered why it kept getting worse. Seemed like every month the food got smaller, and the quality dropped, and Caleb kept saying the budget was the budget." He paused. Didn't make sense for a ranch this size. Thomas, moving through the tables with the coffee, caught Martha's eye through the kitchen doorway. She gave him nothing back, just turned to the stove, but the words had landed somewhere in her chest. "I wondered." How many of them had wondered? How many months had 40 men eaten increasingly bad food and blamed whoever was standing in the kitchen, blamed the cook, blamed the ranch, blamed everything visible instead of the invisible thing that was actually wrong? She thought about the first cook, the one Caleb had let go. Whether that cook had noticed the same gaps she'd noticed and had said something and paid for saying it. She thought about the one who left without his gear, without notice, just gone in the night. A man doesn't leave his gear unless he's leaving in a hurry, unless something happened that made staying feel dangerous. She put another piece of wood on the fire and went back to her eggs. Caleb Thornton came to the kitchen mid-morning and stood in his usual spot in the doorway and looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent the night rearranging what he thought he knew. "The men are talking," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to ask—" He stopped, started again. "When you noticed the flour missing, the third morning, did you know then that it was Reeves?" Martha kept working. "I knew someone was going into the pantry who shouldn't have been. I didn't know who. When you told me Reeves used to manage the supply orders and was friends with the last cook who disappeared overnight, I had a strong suspicion." She paused. "But suspicion isn't the same as knowing." "Why didn't you tell me your suspicion?" She looked at him then. "Because you were the foreman, and he was a man you'd worked with, and I had been here for 3 days. She held his gaze. "A woman who shows up looking the way I look and starts accusing established men of theft on her 3rd day doesn't get listened to. She gets sent away. I needed more time and more evidence." Caleb was quiet. "That's—" He stopped again. "That's a fair assessment," he said finally. "I know it is," Martha said, not unkindly. He nodded. He started to leave, then he turned back. "The man before you," he said. "The one I let go. He said the pantry numbers were wrong. I told him he was miscounting. He said it flat, no excuse in it, which she respected. I was wrong." "Yes," Martha said. "You were." He absorbed that without flinching, which told her something useful about Caleb Thornton, that he was a man who could hold being wrong without needing to fight his way out of it. "Is there anything you need this week?" he asked. "For the kitchen." "The repairs," she said. "And I need someone to go over the supply records with me. The full records, not just the kitchen copies. I want to know exactly what was ordered, what was delivered, and where the gaps are, because if Reeves had a system, and we don't understand the system, we don't know yet if anyone else was part of it." Caleb looked at her sharply. "You think there's more than Reeves?" "I think a man who's been doing this for 4 months or more got comfortable," Martha said. "Comfortable men make arrangements. I want to be sure we know all of the arrangements." She went back to her work. "Bring me the records this afternoon. I'll go through them." He brought the records. She went through them at the work table in the kitchen between lunch cleanup and supper prep, with Thomas sitting across from her making notes when she asked him to, and what she found was both better and worse than she'd expected. Better because the arrangement was simpler than she'd feared. Reeves had been working alone, no elaborate network, just one man exploiting the lack of oversight. Worse because the losses went back further than 4 months. Nearly 8 months in total. A slow bleed that had started small enough to miss and grown confident as no one caught it. She sat back and looked at the numbers. "He was good at it," Thomas said quietly. "He was patient," Martha corrected. "Patient is more dangerous than good." She closed the ledger. "Take this to Mr. Carter. Tell him I've marked the pages." Thomas took the ledger and went. Martha stood up and stretched her back. She had been bent over that table for 2 hours, and looked at the clock on the kitchen wall, and calculated what she still needed to do before supper. She had started the beans that morning. She had the cornbread batter ready. She had the potatoes prepped and waiting. She was making a simple braised pork tonight, with the last of the cured meat she'd found tucked behind a barrel in the back of the cold storage, which was fine quality, but would go off if she left it another day. Nothing wasted. That was the rule she had lived by for 20 years. Nothing wasted. She was back at the stove when the sound from outside stopped her. A horse coming fast on the ranch road. Not the easy trot of someone arriving, the hard rhythm of someone pushed. She heard it come through the front gate, heard the voice of the hand on gate duty, heard the horse pulled to a stop. She kept working. Voices in the yard, more than two now. Something in the pitch of them, not alarm exactly, but something adjacent. Thomas came back through the kitchen door at a near run, which was unusual for Thomas, and his face had lost some of its careful composure. "It's a man from the surveyor's office," he said. "From Miles City. He came with papers." Martha looked at him. "What kind of papers?" "The kind that say a claim has been filed on the Silver Creek water rights." He stopped at the edge of the work table and put both hands flat on it, the way Caleb had put his hands on the desk. "Whitmore filed a claim 3 days ago in Miles City. He's saying the water diversion that Silver Creek Ranch built 6 years ago is illegal and that it gives his land downstream insufficient access." Martha was very still. "Can he do that?" she asked. "His lawyer says he can, or that there's enough argument to make a judge look at it." Thomas's voice was controlled, but his hands on the work table were pressing hard. "If he wins the claim, the ranch loses the right to the diversion. The diversion is how the south pasture gets water. Without it, that pasture goes dry by August. Without the south pasture, the herd can't sustain itself through summer," Martha finished. Thomas nodded. She turned back to the stove. She lifted the lid on the beans and checked them and put the lid back. She adjusted the heat. She did these things with the same movements she used every day, and she let the doing of them hold her steady while the information settled into place. "When did Whitmore file?" she asked. 3 days ago, Thomas said. "The same day he came here with Mr. Carter." Martha kept her hands moving. "So he came here, had his meeting with Mr. Carter, got told the ranch wasn't for sale, rode directly to Miles City, and filed the claim." "Yes." "That's not an argument about water rights," Martha said quietly. "That's a pressure campaign." Thomas looked at her. His young face was doing something complicated. He wanted to be angry, and he was also frightened. And underneath both of those things was the look of someone who was starting to understand that the situation was larger and more deliberate than he had realized. "What do we do?" "Mr. Carter needs a lawyer," Martha said. "A good one. Does he have one?" "There's a man in Millerton who handles ranch business. Henderson." "Is he good?" Thomas hesitated. "He's local." "That's not what I asked." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. Martha nodded. She checked the clock. "Supper in 2 hours." "Go tell Mr. Carter I'd like to speak with him after supper," she said. "Not before. He'll need the evening to look at those papers, and I need to think." Thomas went. Martha stayed at the stove and thought. She was not a lawyer. She was not a landowner. She was a cook from a cattle trail background with no claim to anything on this property, except the job she'd been given 4 days ago. She had no standing in this fight, and no authority to insert herself into it, and she knew that. But she had 20 years of watching how things worked in the West, in places where money and land and water made men into enemies. And she knew something about how a pressure campaign worked. She had seen it twice before. Once in a mining town, where a large company wanted a smaller operator's claim. And once when a cattle baron in Wyoming had spent 8 months making a smaller rancher's life difficult enough that the man finally sold for a quarter of the property's value. Both times, the pressure started with financial trouble. Something to make the target feel the ground moving under his feet. And both times, the target had been alone. William Carter was not alone. He didn't know that yet, but he wasn't. The supper that evening was quieter than the meals had been since Martha arrived. The mess hall filled up as usual, but the talk was lower, the mood different. Word had spread the way it always did on a ranch, fast and comprehensive, and the men knew what the surveyor's papers meant. Some of them had been on Silver Creek long enough to remember building the water diversion 6 years ago. Some of them had spent their work lives on ranches that folded when the water situation went wrong. Martha moved through the kitchen and heard the quiet and understood it. This was not the silence of men eating well and feeling comfortable. This was the silence of men who were worried about their futures. She made sure the meal was as good as anything she had made so far. Better, if she could manage it. Not because good food solved legal problems, but because people made better decisions when they weren't hungry and weren't miserable, and because something good at the table was a reminder that there was something here worth fighting for. Hector Briggs, who had been, in the days since he ate his thirds and gave his reluctant nod, slowly and wordlessly positioning himself as someone who paid attention to the kitchen, came to the kitchen door after the meal and stood there for a moment. "You heard about the water claim," he said. It wasn't a question. "I heard," Martha said. "Bad business," he said. "Yes." How was quiet? Then, "The diversion is solid, built right and built legal. I was here when they put it in. Carter paid a surveyor himself, had the papers filed properly, did everything right." His jaw was tight. "Whitmore knows it. This isn't about whether the diversion is legal. It's about whether Carter can afford the fight." Martha turned and looked at him. "How much does Hector Briggs know about the legal land records in this county?" He blinked. "Some. I've been here 12 years. You pick things up. Could you put what you know in writing? Detailed as you can make it. Dates, measurements, the name of the original surveyor if you remember it, what was filed and where." He looked at her for a moment. "You think that would help? I think a judge who gets a written account from a 12-year ranch veteran who was present when the diversion was built might look at the claim differently than a judge who only has Whitmore's lawyers talking at him." She held his gaze. "I think it can't hurt, and I think you know things that could matter." Hector stood in the doorway for a long moment. The reluctance on his face was fighting with something else, something that had been building since the night he ate his thirds and gave that tiny nod and admitted, at least to himself, that he had been wrong about the woman standing in the kitchen. "I'll write it down," he said. "Good," Martha said. He left. She turned back to the stove. Thomas appeared in the kitchen not 10 minutes later, breathless in his quiet way. "Mr. Carter is ready to see you." She wiped her hands on her apron and followed Thomas across the yard to the main house. William Carter was at the desk in the ranch office with the surveyor's papers spread in front of him and a lamp burning close to the edge of the desk. He looked up when she came in, and there was something in his face that was rawer than what she had seen before. Not quite desperate, but the edge before desperate, the place where a man is still holding his ground but can feel the ground moving. He gestured to the chair across the desk. She sat. He looked at her for a moment, as if deciding how to begin. "Caleb told me you read through the supply ledger this afternoon," he said. "I did. And that you marked the pages. The gaps go back 8 months, she said, not 4. Reeves was careful in the beginning, small enough amounts that they looked like normal variation. He got bolder as months passed and nothing was said." She paused. "The total loss, adding it all up, is somewhere close to $350. The number sat between them. William pressed one hand flat on the desk. $350 was not a catastrophic sum for a healthy ranch. For a ranch already running lean, already stretched, now facing a legal challenge that would cost money to fight, it was a very bad time to have lost it. "And now Whitmore," he said. "And now Whitmore," Martha agreed. "He came here 3 days ago," William started. "And told you something in that meeting that made you come home with that look on your face," Martha said. "And then he went directly to Miles City and filed the claim, which tells me the claim was already prepared, and he was waiting for your answer." She watched his face. "What did he offer you?" William was quiet for a moment. Then, "A fair price. More than fair, on paper. Enough to settle everything and have money left." But this ranch belonged to my wife's family," he said. "She's been gone 6 years. Her parents are gone. I'm the last of it. The land, the water, the name." He paused. "I told him no. I will keep telling him no." His voice was steady on this, steadier than on anything else. "But I need to know if I can hold this." Martha looked at him. She looked at the papers on the desk, and at his hands, and at the lamp burning close to the edge of the desk. And she thought about what she had come to say, the things she had been organizing in her mind since Thomas told her about the claim. "The diversion was built legally," she said. "Hector Briggs was here when it was built. He'll write down everything he knows, dates, the surveyor's name, what was filed. That matters." She paused. "The lawyer in Millerton, Henderson. He's local. I need you to tell me honestly whether he's capable of this kind of fight." William exhaled slowly. "He's handled ranch business, contracts, neighbor disputes. Nothing at this scale." "Then you need someone else," Martha said. "Or him plus someone else. Someone who knows water law in this territory, who has been in front of a judge on a claim like this before." She held his gaze. "I know this isn't my place to say—" "Say it," William said. He said it simply, the way he had said thank you 2 nights ago, plain, no decoration. "This is a pressure campaign," Martha said. "Whitmore knows the diversion is legal. He's not filing this claim because he thinks he can win it. He's filing it because he knows it will cost you money to fight it. And he already knows this ranch has been losing money for 8 months because someone told him." She paused. "Or because he caused it." The silence in the office became a different kind of silence. William was very still. "Say that again," he said. "Reeves was skimming supply money for 8 months," Martha said, keeping her voice level and careful. "Whitmore has been trying to buy this ranch for 2 years. A man who wants a property badly enough thinks about how to create pressure, and financial pressure is the most reliable kind." She let it sit for a moment. "I'm not saying Whitmore paid Reeves to steal from your kitchen. I'm saying the timeline fits and the outcome served Whitmore's purposes exactly." She paused. "Someone good at law might want to look at whether Reeves and Whitmore have any connection." William stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. She could feel him moving, the shift of weight and air in the room, and stood there for a moment with his back to her. "I've known Edward Whitmore for 10 years, he said. His voice was very controlled. "His ranch is 3 miles north. We've had dinner at each other's tables." "I know," Martha said. "That's what makes it hard to look at." He was quiet for a long time. "If you're right." He stopped. "I might not be," Martha said. "It might be coincidence. Reeves might be just what he appears to be, a dishonest man who took advantage of a gap in oversight. The timing might be exactly what it looks like, and nothing more." She kept her voice steady, but a thorough lawyer would look. William turned around. His face had gone into that deep quiet she had seen before, the settling that happened when he had received something difficult and was processing it without letting it knock him over. She was beginning to understand that this was simply how he worked. That the quiet was not weakness, it was the opposite. "I'll send for someone from Miles City," he said. "A specialist. Henderson can handle the local filings, but I want someone who knows water law." He paused. "It'll cost money I don't have right now." $350 was stolen, Martha said. "If Reeves can be found and held accountable, some of that might come back." She paused. "And the kitchen is running properly now. You'll stop bleeding money from that direction." Something changed in his face. Not a smile, too heavy a moment for a smile, but the thing that lives in the same neighborhood, a loosening. "You walked through that gate 6 days ago," he said, "with a cloth bag and a cast-iron pan." "And my mother's recipes," Martha said. "And your mother's recipes." He looked at her. "I don't entirely know what to make of you, Martha." "Most people don't," she said, and stood up. "But I'm here, and the kitchen runs, and I'm not going anywhere." She straightened her apron. "Good night, Mr. Carter." She left him in the office with the lamp burning and the surveyor's papers spread on the desk and, she hoped, something steadier than what he'd had before she came in. The week that followed moved fast. William sent to Miles City for a lawyer. A man named Aldrich, who came highly recommended by the bank. A sharp-featured man in his 50s, who wore a suit that had been pressed within an inch of its life, and looked around Silver Creek Ranch with the efficient gaze of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly. He met with William. He met with Caleb. He asked to speak with Hector Briggs after reading the written account Hector had produced. 4 pages, detailed and precise, with dates and the surveyor's name, and a sketch of the diversion construction that Hector had drawn from memory with the care of a man who had been there and paid attention. When Aldrich finished reading Hector's account, he looked up and said, "This is excellent." Hector, who was sitting across from him in the ranch office, said nothing. But Martha, passing by in the hallway with a tray of coffee she'd brought from the kitchen, saw his jaw relax by a fraction. Aldrich reviewed the supply ledger as well. He asked questions about Reeves, when he'd been hired, who had hired him, what his arrangement with the ranch had been. He asked about the connection between Reeves and the previous cook. He asked whether anyone had seen Reeves in conversation with Whitmore or anyone from Whitmore's property. That last question produced something unexpected. Big Jim, who had been pulled in to answer some questions at Caleb's request, because Big Jim had the longest memory on the property after Hector, sat in the office and thought for a long moment. "Once," he said, "about 6 months ago, I was in Millerton picking up hardware supplies, and I saw Reeves at the saloon. He was sitting with 2 men I didn't know. I didn't think anything of it." He paused. "But one of those men, I found out later because I asked around, worked for Whitmore, handled his business accounts." The office went very quiet. Aldrich wrote something in his notebook. "Would you testify to that?" he asked. Big Jim looked at William. William said nothing, left it to him. "Yes," Big Jim said, "if it helps." Martha heard this later from Thomas, who heard it from the office doorway with the particular skill of a young man who had learned early that important things happened in rooms you were technically not in. She was at the stove when Thomas told her, and she kept her hands working and said nothing for a long moment. "It doesn't prove anything," Thomas said. Aldrich said as much, "but it's a thread." "Threads become ropes," Martha said. "Keep going." What she didn't tell Thomas was that her hands had stopped moving for a full 3 seconds while he talked. That brief, involuntary stillness of someone who has been holding a theory and just watched the first real evidence of it walk into the room. She was glad she was facing the stove. The pressure came from a different direction the following morning. She was in the middle of bread prep, 3 large loaves, hands deep in dough, when she heard wheels on the ranch road and looked up through the kitchen window to see a buggy she recognized. Edward Whitmore, arriving without notice at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. She kept her hands in the dough. She heard him greet the hand at the gate. She heard him ask for William Carter. She heard the answer, "Mr. Carter is unavailable at present," and Whitmore's voice shift in register slightly, the particular shift of a man who is accustomed to access and is recalibrating. She heard him ask for Caleb Thornton instead. She didn't hear Caleb's response, but she heard the boots on the porch outside the main house, and then nothing more for a while. She worked her dough. Thomas came in 15 minutes later, walking quickly. "Whitmore is in the office with Caleb," he said. "I know," Martha said. "He's making a new offer." Thomas's voice was tight. "A higher one. He came to tell Caleb directly because William is in his study with Aldrich. He's—" Thomas paused, choosing his word. "Pushing." "Let him push," Martha said. Thomas looked at her. "You're not worried?" Martha folded the dough and turned it and pressed it flat with the heel of her hand. "I'm focused on bread," she said. "Mr. Carter knows his own mind. Caleb knows his job. Aldrich knows the law. I know the kitchen. Everybody doing their job is better than everybody panicking about somebody else's job." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not afraid of any of this, are you?" Martha glanced at him sideways. "I've been afraid every day since I walked through that gate," she said. "Afraid of being sent away. Afraid of not being enough. Afraid of finding trouble and not knowing what to do with it." She pressed the dough again. "But afraid and stopped are different things. I stopped being afraid of being stopped a long time ago." Thomas looked at her for a moment longer than usual. The young man's face was doing something that was hard to read. Complicated, layered, like someone rearranging something inside themselves. "I want to be like that," he said. It came out simple, no performance in it. "You're working on it," Martha said. "Now go find out what Whitmore said when he left." Whitmore was in the office with Caleb for 20 minutes. When he came out, He walked across the yard toward his buggy, and he passed close enough to the kitchen window that Martha could see his face. He was not a man who lost composure easily. She could see that. But there was something around his eyes that was doing something quick and controlled. The look of a man who had gone into a room expecting a result and come out without it. He stopped at the gate and said something to the hand there, and the hand said something back, and Whitmore got into his buggy and drove away at a pace that was slightly too deliberate. The pace of a man who wants to look calm and is working at it. Martha took her bread out of the oven. Caleb came to the kitchen door 10 minutes later and stood in his spot in the doorway. "He doubled the offer," Caleb said. "I know," Martha said. "How do you know?" "The look on his face when he left told me the offer hadn't worked," she said. "If he was just here to deliver a letter, his face wouldn't have looked like that." She set the bread on the cooling rack. "What did you say to him?" Caleb crossed his arms. "I said I didn't have the authority to accept or decline offers on behalf of Mr. Carter, and that Mr. Carter was unavailable." "Good." "He wasn't happy." "Good," Martha said again. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, he said something as he was leaving, said that the water claim was going to take months to work through the courts, and that during those months, the uncertainty alone would make the ranch hard to operate, hard to hire, hard to borrow against, hard to do business. He paused. He said that by the time it was resolved, the original offer would look generous compared to what he'd be able to give. Martha looked at Caleb. "Is that true? About the uncertainty making things hard?" Caleb exhaled. "Some of it. Banks don't like lending to a property with an active claim against it. It could slow things down." "Then we don't slow down," Martha said simply. "We run the ranch. We do the work. We let Aldrich do his job, and we don't give Whitmore anything he can use to argue that this ranch is struggling." She picked up the cooling bread and looked at it. "You mentioned the men's morale the first day I was here. Whether I was tough enough for them. How's their morale now?" Caleb blinked. "Better," he said. "Considerably better, since—" He stopped. "Since the food got good," Martha finished. "So keep it good. Keep the men fed and working and feeling like this is a place worth standing behind." She looked at him. "Because it is. And Whitmore knows that. That's why he doubled the offer instead of waiting." Caleb studied her for a long moment. "You know," he said, "when you walked into my office 2 weeks ago, I thought you were the most confident desperado I'd ever seen." "I was desperate," Martha said. "Confident and desperate aren't mutually exclusive." Something shifted in his face, finally, fully, the last remnant of the look he'd given her in the office that first day. The inventory and dismissal look. It was gone now, replaced with something plain and direct. "I'm glad William said yes to one dinner," he said. Martha looked back at her bread. "So am I," she said. That evening, for the first time since she had arrived at Silver Creek Ranch, William Carter came to supper in the mess hall with the men. He sat at the long table, not at the head, just in a place in the middle, the way a man sits when he's not trying to make a statement, but simply wants to be somewhere. The men around him shifted slightly to make room with the ease of men who were comfortable with him. And the talk around the table continued, without the stiff pause that sometimes happened when a boss entered a room. Martha watched through the kitchen doorway. She watched Hector Briggs say something to William that made William nod. She watched Big Jim pass the bread basket to him without ceremony. She watched Thomas refill his coffee without being asked. She watched William Carter sit in his own mess hall with his own men and eat food that was good and feel, she thought, something like less alone. She turned back to the kitchen. She had a pie cooling on the rack. Another one, because she had found more dried peach in the pantry, and she was going to use everything there was. And she was cutting it into portions when she heard boots at the kitchen door. She expected Thomas. It was William. He stood in the doorway without his usual careful quality. No deliberateness, no sense of calculation. He looked tired and real in the way people look when they have stopped managing how they appear. "Good meal," he said. "Thank you," she said. He looked at the pie. "Is that for the men?" "It's for whoever wants it," she said. He leaned against the doorframe, a thing she had not seen him do before, that casual lean of a man who is not performing anything, and looked at her. Aldrich told me today that the connection between Reeves and Whitmore's account man is worth pursuing, he said. That if we can establish that Whitmore deliberately destabilized this ranch's financial situation to force a sale, the water claim becomes much smaller problem. It becomes evidence of a larger pattern. He paused. He thinks we have a real case. Martha nodded. I wanted to tell you, William said, because you're the one who suggested looking for the connection. I suggested it because it fit, she said. Aldrich will know better than I do whether it holds. It fits, William said. He was quiet for a moment. You've been here 2 weeks. I know, she said. You found the supply theft, helped expose Reeves, suggested the strategy that might save the ranch's legal position, kept 40 men fed and in good spirits during the worst stretch this property has had in years. He stopped. What were you doing for the 3 weeks before you got here? Before the walking? Martha was quiet for a moment. She set down the pie knife and thought about how to answer. About the boarding house in Billings and the owner who sold it to a man who brought his own family to run it and gave Martha 1 month's notice. About the month after that and the month after that. The systematic rejection of a large woman in her mid-30s who had no husband and no property, and nothing to show but her skills and her mother's recipes folded in her coat pocket. About what it cost to keep walking when every door was closed. About the particular kind of tired that isn't in your feet, but in the part of you that keeps deciding to try again. She didn't say any of that. Looking for exactly this, she said. A place that needed what I had. William Carter looked at her for a long moment. Outside in the mess hall, someone laughed at something. The full, easy laugh of a man who is not guarded, and it rolled through the kitchen door and settled in the room between them like something alive. I think you found it, William said quietly, and Martha, who had spent most of her adult life being told in 100 different ways by 100 different people what she couldn't have and where she didn't belong, felt something shift in her chest that was too large and too complicated to name. She picked up the pie knife. Go get some pie, she said, before the men finish it all. He smiled, a real one, a small one, the kind that didn't need an audience, and went back to the mess hall. Martha stood in the kitchen and listened to the sounds of Silver Creek Ranch at the end of a hard day, and she breathed, and she did not allow herself to cry, which took more effort than anyone watching her perfectly still face would ever have guessed. She cut the remaining pie into even portions. She made sure every man got a piece. 3 weeks after Dale Reeves walked off Silver Creek Ranch without his gear, a letter arrived from Miles City that changed the shape of everything. Martha was in the kitchen when Thomas brought it in. Not to William, not to Caleb, but to her, which told her something about how the hierarchy of the ranch had quietly shifted in ways nobody had formally announced. He set it on the work table beside her bread dough and said, "It's from Aldrich," and then stood back with his arms at his sides like a man waiting for a verdict. She wiped her hands on her apron and picked it up and read it. Then she read it again. "Go get Mr. Carter," she said. Thomas went at a near run. The letter was precise and lawyerly in its language, but its meaning was not complicated. Aldrich had located Dale Reeves in a town 40 miles east, staying at a boarding house under his own name, with the particular lack of caution of a man who didn't think anyone was looking for him. More importantly, Aldrich had found what he was actually looking for. A series of payments made from an account associated with one of Edward Whitmore's subsidiary business interests to a man matching Reeves's description, beginning 9 months ago, 3 weeks before the supply theft started, and ending the day Reeves left Silver Creek Ranch. The payments were not large. They didn't need to be. $30 a month to a man with access to a ranch's supply budget was enough to hollow out a kitchen over 8 months without anyone noticing until it was too late. Aldrich's letter said, "I believe we can establish a direct evidentiary connection between Mr. Whitmore and the financial sabotage of Silver Creek Ranch. This changes the nature of our response to the water claim considerably. I would like to meet at your earliest convenience." William read it standing at the work table. Martha watched his face go through something she recognized now, that deep quiet, that settling, and then come out the other side into something harder and cleaner. "He paid Reeves," William said. "That's what it looks like," Martha said, "for 9 months, while sitting at my dinner table." He set the letter down. His voice was very controlled. While telling me the water rights situation was getting complicated, and that a sale would be in both our interests. While creating the situation that made the sale look necessary, Martha said. I was already moving toward the door. Then he stopped and turned back. Martha. He said her name the way he had started saying it over the past weeks. Not as a formality, not as a title, but as the specific word for a specific person he had come to know. This letter, if you hadn't found the supply discrepancy, if you hadn't pushed me to look at the connections, Aldrich wouldn't have known where to look. She looked back at him steadily. You'd have found it eventually. Maybe, he said. Or maybe Whitmore's pressure would have worked, and I'd have sold before anyone found it. He held her gaze. I won't forget this. He left. Martha turned back to her bread dough and put her hands into it and worked in silence for a long moment, feeling the particular weight of what had just happened settle through her like something heavy finding its level. Outside in the yard, she could hear the ranch starting its morning. Horses, voices, the rhythm of a working day. The sounds of a place that was still standing, still running, still fighting. She pressed the dough flat and folded it and pressed it again. Caleb Thornton came to the kitchen 20 minutes later with the expression of a man who had already been told the news and was still processing it. William's going to Miles City, he said. I know. He told me about the letter. Caleb leaned against the doorframe. She had noticed that the men had all started doing this, leaning in the doorway rather than staying outside it, as if the kitchen had become a place they moved toward instead of past. If this holds up in court, if Aldrich can prove Whitmore deliberately sabotaged this ranch, then the water claim falls apart, Martha said, because a judge who sees deliberate financial sabotage as part of a pattern looks at the water claim differently. It's not a legitimate legal dispute anymore. It's another pressure tactic in a campaign. Caleb was quiet. You know a lot about this kind of thing for a cook. I've lived in the West my whole life, Martha said. I've watched powerful men do this to smaller operations more than once. She kept working. Knowing how something works doesn't require having a law degree. It just requires paying attention. Caleb was quiet for another moment. Then, when he gets back, when this is settled. He stopped. She looked up at him. The men are talking, he said, about you staying, not just as the cook, about... He seemed to be choosing his words with unusual care. About what this ranch looks like now, compared to 3 months ago. The difference you've made. He met her eyes. I wanted you to know that conversation is happening. Martha held his gaze for a moment. Is that you telling me, or the men asking you to tell me? Both, he said honestly. She went back to her dough. I'm not going anywhere, Caleb. I told Mr. Carter that 3 weeks ago, and it's still true. She paused. But I appreciate you saying it. He nodded once. He was halfway out the door when she spoke again. Caleb. He turned. The first morning, when you looked me over in that office and decided what I was before I said a word. She kept her hands in the dough. It cost you 4 months of bad food and probably contributed to the environment where Reeves thought he could get away with what he did. When people in charge make fast judgments based on what things look like instead of what they are, it creates gaps. And gaps are where the bad things happen. The silence that followed was long enough to feel like something. I know, he said. His voice was quiet and completely honest. I know that. She nodded. Go run the ranch, she said. William needs it in good order when he gets back. I went. She finished the bread and put it in the oven and started on the morning's other tasks, moving through the kitchen with the focused efficiency of someone who had made peace with the pace required of her. And she thought about what Caleb had said about the men talking. About what this ranch looked like now compared to 3 months ago. She thought about what she had looked like 3 months ago, walking into Millerton on feet that were screaming, going from business to business asking for work and being told no, being looked at and assessed and found wanting before she opened her mouth. The particular exhaustion of that. The weight of being seen wrong so many times that you started to feel the wrongness yourself, to wonder whether the people looking at you were seeing something you'd stopped being able to see. And then she thought about the morning 2 days ago when she had caught sight of herself in the window glass of the kitchen. Not deliberately, just a passing glimpse, and had not flinched. Had looked for a full second at her own reflection and seen not what the world had always told her it saw, but something else. A woman with flour on her hands, standing in her kitchen on a working ranch at 7 in the morning, with 40 men to feed and a full pantry and a stove that ran right. A woman who belonged where she was. She turned back to the stove and did not allow herself to dwell on it, because dwelling was a luxury and she had bread to manage. William was gone for 4 days. In his absence, the ranch ran exactly as it needed to. The men worked, the horses were cared for, the fence line got the repair it had needed on the eastern section, and the kitchen produced 3 good meals a day without interruption. Martha noticed that the men moved through their days with a different quality now than when she had first arrived. Less of the grinding, resentful energy of people who have been consistently failed. More of the purposeful rhythm of people who trust that the basic things are being handled. It was a small thing. But small things were where everything started and where everything ended, and Martha knew better than most people how much a good meal did for a man's sense that the world was manageable. Hector Briggs stopped at the kitchen door on the 3rd evening. He had made a habit of this, a brief stop after supper, sometimes with something to say and sometimes without, and stood with his coffee cup in his hand, looking out into the yard. "You reckon Carter's got enough?" he asked. "With Aldrich, to make Whitmore back down?" "I reckon Aldrich is good at his job," Martha said. "And the evidence is what it is." "Whitmore's got money and connections," Hector said. It wasn't an argument, just a fact, stated plainly by a man who believed in stating facts plainly. "He's also got a documented pattern of fraud and conspiracy," Martha said. "Money and connections matter less in front of a judge when the other side has that." She paused. "And William Carter has something Whitmore didn't account for." "What's that?" "People who'll stand up for him." She looked at Hector. "Your written account. Big Jim's testimony. 40 men who know what this ranch is and what was done to it." She paused. Whitmore thought he was dealing with a man alone. He wasn't. Hector was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the yard. He said, in the particular way of a man who is making a concession that costs him something, "I thought you were going to last 2 days, maybe 3. "I know," Martha said. "I was wrong about that." "You were," she agreed. He nodded once, the same reluctant, precise nod he had given her across the mess hall after that first supper. He went back inside. Martha listened to his boots on the floor and thought about what it took for a man like Hector Briggs to say "I was wrong" out loud and mean it, and she gave it the respect it deserved in the privacy of her own mind. On the 4th day, William came back. He came back in the late afternoon, riding fast, which was the first thing. William Carter was not a man who rode fast unnecessarily. He had the quality of someone who conserved energy deliberately, who understood that urgency and haste were different things and confused them at your peril. When he came through the gate at a pace that raised dust, 3 of the hands stopped what they were doing and watched. He went straight to the office. Caleb followed him in. The door closed. Martha started supper. Thomas lasted approximately 14 minutes before he materialized in the kitchen doorway with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. "He's back," Thomas said. "I know," Martha said. "I heard the horse. He went straight to the office." "I know that too." Thomas stood in the doorway, radiating constrained urgency. Martha took pity on him. "Go stand near the office window," she said, "and come tell me what you hear." How was gone before she finished the sentence. She made supper. She made a proper chicken stew. She had gotten a good supply order through the week before, and the pantry was fuller now than it had been since she arrived, with dumplings that she made from scratch, the way her mother had, pressing the dough with her thumbs and dropping each piece into the simmering broth. She made a pan of cornbread and a dish of stewed greens with a piece of salt pork for flavor. And she had a dried apple cake cooling on the rack that she had made that afternoon, because something in her had decided that this evening was going to need something good at the end of it, one way or another. Thomas came back in 40 minutes. His face was no longer trying to be neutral. "Aldrich got a signed statement from Reeves," he said. Reeves confessed. All of it. The arrangement with Whitmore's man, the supply skimming, the instructions to create conditions that would push the ranch into financial trouble. He was speaking quickly, the way he did when he was too full of something to pace it. Whitmore's man, the one from the account Big Jim saw Reeves with, has also been deposed. He told Aldrich that Whitmore authorized the payments. Thomas stopped and took a breath. Aldrich filed everything with the territorial court this morning before William left Miles City. Whitmore's lawyers were notified this afternoon. Martha set down the wooden spoon. She stood at the stove for a moment, with both hands resting on the edge of it, not gripping, just resting, and let what Thomas had just said find its proper place. Whitmore had been caught. Not suspected. Not accused. Caught, with signed statements, with financial records, with a witness account from Big Jim that now had corroboration from the account man himself. The water claim was already weakened, and now it was something worse than weakened. It was the culminating piece of evidence in a pattern of deliberate fraud against Silver Creek Ranch. "Did Aldrich say what Whitmore will do?" she asked. "He thinks Whitmore will settle," Thomas said, quietly and fast, before this gets into the public record any more than it already has. His business interests in this county depend on his reputation, and... Thomas paused. Aldrich also said that if it goes to court, Whitmore is looking at serious legal consequences, not just civil, criminal. Martha picked up the wooden spoon. She went back to her dumplings. "Good," she said. Thomas was staring at her. "That's all you're going to say? What would you like me to say?" "I don't know, something. You started this whole thing. You found the supply discrepancy. You suggested looking at the Whitmore connection. Without you, none of this." "Without Hector, Aldrich wouldn't have had the construction record," Martha said. "Without Big Jim's memory, there was no witness. Without Caleb going through the ledger, Reeves would have had time to cover his tracks. Without William refusing to sell when Whitmore wanted him to, none of the rest of it mattered." She stirred the stew. "I noticed something. Other people did things with it. That's how it works." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "You're the most exasperating person on this ranch," he said. "And I mean that with complete respect." "Go set the tables," Martha said. "Supper's in an hour." He went, shaking his head. She listened to him go and stood at the stove and allowed herself, in the full privacy of an empty kitchen, with the fire running hot and the stew smelling right and the cake cooling on the rack, to feel what the news actually did to her. It felt like a door opening, not for her specifically. She was careful about that, careful not to make someone else's victory into her story. But the door opening that happened when a place you had put yourself into the service of was going to survive. When the thing you had been working toward, quietly and steadily, and without naming it, was actually going to hold. Silver Creek Ranch was going to hold. She turned the heat down on the stew and checked the cornbread and let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she picked up the spoon and went back to work. William Carter did not come to supper that evening. He came to the kitchen instead. Not at the end of this meal, the way he had been doing. Not after the men were fed and the tables cleared and the evening settling into its own quiet rhythm. He came while she was still cooking, while the stove was running hot and the kitchen was loud with the sounds of food almost ready. And he came in not with his usual careful quality, but with a directness that was different from anything she had seen in him before. He stood inside the kitchen door, not in the doorway, inside, actually in the room, and he looked at her. "Thomas told you," she said without turning around. "I figured he would," William said. "I wasn't going to ask you to wait." He paused. "Aldrich thinks Whitmore will send a representative within the week, to settle. The water claim will be dropped. The financial damages, what Whitmore owes for the supply theft, plus the cost of the legal defense, plus the losses to the ranch's operation, will be negotiated. But Aldrich says we're negotiating from strength now." "Good," Martha said. $350 wasn't the whole number, William said. Once Aldrich went through everything, all the ways the sabotage affected ranch operations, the cost of the bad hires, the lost productivity from unhappy workers, the increased costs from emergency supply orders after the pantry ran out, the actual damage is closer to $800. Martha was quiet. $800. A working ranch's entire season, sometimes. The difference between a property that survived the winter and one that didn't. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be sorry," William said. "We'll get it back." He paused. "Martha, look at me." She turned around. Howe was standing in this kitchen with his hat in his hands and his face open in the way it only got when he had stopped managing what he showed. And he was looking at her with something in his eyes that she recognized but had not expected to see there, or not expected to see directed at her, which was a different thing entirely. "You saved this ranch," he said. "I cooked dinner," she said. "Don't do that," he said, and his voice had something firm in it. "Don't make it smaller than it is. I've been watching you do that every time someone gives you credit for something. You find a way to spread it around or minimize it or turn it into a joke." He took a step forward. "You walked through that gate with nothing. You took a kitchen that was falling apart, and a ranch that was bleeding, and a group of men who were ready to give up, and you—" He stopped. Started again. "You fed them. You really fed them. Not just food. Something else. Something that made them feel like this place was worth something again." He paused. "Something that made me feel like it was worth something again." The kitchen was very quiet except for the stove. Martha looked at William Carter standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, and she thought about all the things she could say. The deflections she was very good at. The redirection to other people's contributions. The practical observation that she had simply done her job. She said none of them. "This ranch is worth something," she said instead. "It always was. It just needed someone to remember that." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen, not slowly, not with hesitation, but directly, the way he moved when he had decided something. And he stood close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes from years of Montana sun, and something in them that she had been careful not to look at too directly for the past 3 weeks. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask me anything," she said. "When this is settled, when Whitmore is dealt with and the ranch is back on solid ground." He was choosing his words with the same care he used for everything important. "Would you consider, would it be something you'd want, to be more than the cook?" Martha looked at him. "More than the cook," she repeated. "I'm not saying it well," he said. He didn't look away. "I'm saying that in the month you've been here, this ranch has become something I recognize again. Something I'm glad to come home to." He paused. "And a large part of that is you. Not just the kitchen. You." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to decide anything now. I'm asking whether it's something you'd be willing to think about." The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove made its low sound. Outside, the mess hall was filling up with the voices of 40 men sitting down to supper, and the sound of it was warm and real. Martha looked at William Carter, at the careful, direct, tired man who had given her one dinner's worth of chance and meant it, who had listened when she spoke and acted on what she said, who had sat in his own mess hall with his own men and eaten her food and looked less alone. And she thought about her mother, about the voice she carried in her chest. "You'll know the right place when you're in it, Martha girl. It won't be loud about it. It'll just feel like somewhere you can breathe. I've been thinking about it since the 2nd week," she said. Something happened in his face that was too large and too real to be called just a smile. "Then I'll wait until you've finished thinking," he said. "I'm finished," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. Outside, someone in the mess hall laughed. The full, easy laugh she had come to love as the sound of this ranch being alive. And it came through the door and settled around them. "Go eat supper," she said. "The stew will be better hot." He went. And for the 3rd time in a month, Martha Ellison stood in the kitchen of Silver Creek Ranch and talked herself out of something she was absolutely going to feel later. She put the food on the table and fed her people. The settlement came 8 days after that. Whitmore's lawyer arrived at Silver Creek Ranch on a Tuesday morning. A careful, quiet man named Prescott, who wore the expression of someone who had delivered bad news before and had developed a professional peace with it. He met with William and Aldrich, who had ridden in from Miles City the night before, and Caleb sat in because William asked him to, and Martha brought coffee and then was thanked and dismissed, which was fine. It wasn't her meeting. She had a kitchen to run. She heard the voices through the wall. Not words mostly, but the quality of voices in negotiation, the back-and-forth rhythm of it, the pauses and the resumptions. She made a good lunch and said nothing and worked and waited. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When Prescott left, he left alone, which told her something. William came to the kitchen 15 minutes later. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen since the early days. A bone-deep tired, the kind that follows something that has been held for a long time, finally letting go. But underneath it, or inside it, or wherever the better things lived in a man when he stopped fighting a war, there was something else. He sat down on the stool in the corner of the kitchen. He sat down without asking, without ceremony, the way a man sits down in a room where he is comfortable. "The claim is dropped," he said. "In full, no contest." Martha kept working. "And the damages?" $720, he said. "Whitmore is making a personal payment. Restitution, Aldrich called it. He'll probably call it something else to anyone who asks." He paused. "The condition of the settlement is that we don't pursue the criminal charges." Aldrich advised taking it. He said the civil settlement was certain and a criminal trial was not, and that certainty was worth more than principle in this case. He looked at his hands. I agreed with him. "You did the right thing," Martha said. "I wanted to push further," he said. "I know," she said. "But the ranch needed the certainty more than it needed the principle." She looked at him. "The ranch is what matters." He was quiet for a moment. "Whitmore is selling his northern property," he said. Quietly. "He told Prescott to tell me, I think as a gesture, or maybe just information, that he's moving his business interests east." He paused. "I won't see him again." Martha nodded. "William," she said. He looked up. "It's over," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. And then, quietly, without drama, in the plain light of the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, he put his face in his hands, and Martha Ellison understood that the exhaustion and the relief and the weight of the months behind him had finally come due, and she let him be in it. She did not go to him, did not speak, did not try to manage what he was feeling into something smaller or more comfortable. She had learned a long time ago that some things needed the full space they took up, and that the most respectful thing you could do was give them that space without trying to fill it. She went to the stove and turned the heat down on the beans, and adjusted the cornbread and let the sounds of the kitchen do what kitchen sounds did. That particular combination of warmth and ordinary purpose that reminded people the world had a normal in it somewhere. After a while, William lifted his face. He was not embarrassed. She respected that enormously. $720, he said, in a different voice than before, lighter. "I haven't had that much money clear at once in 2 years." "The ranch will run better now," Martha said. "The pantry is properly stocked. The men are steady. The south pasture has water." She paused. "And Caleb knows to look harder at the things he looks past." William almost laughed. "Did you tell him that?" "I told him something like that," she said. He stood up from the stool. He stood in the kitchen and looked around it, at the pots on the stove and the bread cooling on the rack and the work table she had made her own over the past month. Every inch of it organized in the particular way of a person who knows where everything is without looking. And he looked at it all as if seeing it properly for the first time. "This is the heart of this ranch," he said. "I used to think it was the cattle, or the water, or the land." He paused. "It's this room." "It's the people in this room," Martha said. He looked at her. She looked back. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and fell across the work table and the cooling bread and the woman standing at the stove, who had arrived at this ranch 4 weeks ago with nothing but a cast-iron pan and a dead woman's recipes. And William Carter saw her, really saw her, the way she had needed to be seen for most of her life, and did not look away. "I told you I wasn't asking you to decide anything right away," he said, "when I asked before." "You did," she said. "I'm going to ask again anyway," he said, "because I've had a difficult morning, and apparently bad mornings make me brave." He held her gaze. "I'd like you to stay. Not just as the cook. I'd like—" He stopped. "I'd like to know if there's something here that's worth building toward. Between us. If that's something you'd want." Martha looked at him. She thought about what she had said to Thomas, afraid and stopped are different things. And she thought about her mother. And she thought about the morning she had seen her own reflection in the kitchen window and had not flinched. She thought about 35 years of being told she was not enough, not right, not what anyone was looking for, and about the month she had just spent being exactly what this place needed, being seen for it, being valued for it, by these men and by this man standing in front of her who had given her one dinner's worth of chance and meant every word of it. She set down the wooden spoon. "William," she said, "I have been building toward it since the second week. I just didn't think you'd been paying the same kind of attention." He took one step toward her. "I've been paying attention since you put that pan down on Caleb's desk," he said. "That was my first day," she said. "I know," he said. "I was watching from the porch." He stopped close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes and what was living in them, clear and unhurried and completely decided. "I'd decided something by the time you walked into the kitchen." "You could have said so sooner," she said. "I didn't want to complicate your position," he said. "You'd just arrived. You were fighting to prove yourself. I wasn't going to add that to your plate." He paused. "Was that the wrong call?" Martha thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "It was the right call." She looked at him. "But I'm glad you're making a different one now." He reached out and took her hand, the right one, the one with the old burn scars along the palm from 20 years of hot iron, and held it in both of his. He looked at it for a moment. "These hands built something here," he said quietly. Martha felt something in her chest that she had spent most of her adult life convincing herself she didn't need. She let herself feel it. "Yes," she said, "they did." Outside in the yard, somebody rang the bell for something. Not the meal bell, some signal between the working hands. And the sound carried clean and sharp through the kitchen window, and Silver Creek Ranch went on doing what it did, the way it would keep doing, the way it was going to keep doing for a long time yet. Martha Ellison stood in her kitchen with her scarred hand held in the hands of a man who had looked at her and seen her right, and she did not deflect, and she did not minimize, and she did not find a way to make the moment smaller than it was. She let it be exactly what it was. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had walked 3 weeks across open Montana plains to find, even though she hadn't known, when she set out, what she was looking for. She had known only one thing when she picked up that cast iron pan and started walking: that her hands had something to give, that somewhere there was a place that needed what she had, that she was not going to stop until she found it. She had found it. The stew bubbled on the stove. The bread sat cooling on the rack. 40 men were going to come through the door in an hour and eat well and feel, for another evening, like they were somewhere that held them. Martha let go of William's hand and picked up the wooden spoon. "Supper's not going to make itself," she said. He laughed. A real one, full, unguarded, the laugh of a man who had put something down after carrying it for a very long time. "No," he said. "I reckon it won't." He stayed in the kitchen until the bell rang, and when the men came in, and the mess hall filled up with voices, and the scrape of chairs, and the particular warm noise of people being fed by someone who understood what they needed, William Carter sat at the long table in the middle of his men, and Martha Ellison stood at the stove in her kitchen, and Silver Creek Ranch sounded like something that was going to last. The morning after the settlement, Martha woke before dawn the way she always did, laced her boots the way she always did, and walked across the yard to the kitchen in the dark the way she always did. Some things don't change just because everything else has. She built the fire in the stove and stood over it for a moment, with her hands spread toward the heat, and thought about the night before. William's laugh in the kitchen, full and unguarded, the sound of it settling into the room like something that had always meant to be there. She thought about his hands holding hers. She thought about $720 and a dropped water claim, and a man named Whitmore, who was quietly selling his northern property and moving his business interests east and would not be coming back. She thought about all of it for exactly as long as it took the fire to catch properly. Then she started breakfast. Big Jim was the first one through the mess hall door that morning, the way he almost always was. Big Jim operated on the theory that the early arrival got the best bread, and he had been proven right often enough that it had become a religion. He sat down at his usual place and looked at the plate Thomas set in front of him, and then looked up at Thomas with an expression that was working very hard to seem casual. "Heard the settlement came through," he said. "Yesterday afternoon," Thomas said. Big Jim looked at his plate. He picked up his fork. He put it down again. He was a large man, with large feelings, that he managed through a complicated system of indirection and implication. And right now, the system was strained. "Ranch is going to be all right," he said. Not a question. "Ranch is going to be all right," Thomas confirmed. Big Jim picked his fork back up and ate his breakfast without another word on the subject. But Martha, watching through the kitchen doorway, saw something happen in the set of his shoulders. A releasing, a lowering, the physical translation of a weight put down. And she turned back to her stove and felt that same releasing move through her own body. By mid-morning, the news had done what news always did on a working ranch. Moved fast and changed shape as it went, acquiring detail here and losing it there, arriving at each person already half transformed by the person who had delivered it. What arrived at the far end of the property, where two hands were working the eastern fence line, was that Whitmore had paid up and left the county. What arrived at the stable was that the water claim had been thrown out entirely. What was true was somewhere between all of it and more specific than any of it, but the essential fact was the same at every stop. Silver Creek Ranch had held. Caleb Thornton spent the morning being unusually quiet. Martha noticed because Caleb's particular brand of quiet was different from other people's. It had texture to it, layers, the quiet of a man doing significant internal work. She had learned to read it over the past month, the way she learned to read a stove that ran hot on the left side and cool on the right. You worked with what it was, not what you wanted it to be. He came to the kitchen at mid-afternoon, when the lunch cleanup was done and supper prep hadn't fully started. The narrow window in the day when the kitchen was quietest. He stood in the doorway, but then he came inside, actually came inside the kitchen, which he had never done before. He stood a few feet from the work table with his hat in his hands, which told her the rest of what she needed to know before he opened his mouth. "I owe you something," he said. Martha looked at him. "You don't owe me anything, Caleb." "I do," he said. "And I need to say it right, so let me." He looked at the hat in his hands, then back at her. "The morning you came through that gate, the way I treated you, the way I looked at you. I've been thinking about it since the third day you were here. Since about the time Hector asked for thirds." He stopped. "No, before that. Since you said give me one dinner and meant it in a way that should have told me everything I needed to know, and I still spent the rest of the day expecting you to fail." Martha set down what she was doing and gave him her full attention, because he was giving her his, and he deserved the same. "I've been a foreman for 9 years, he said. "I know how to read men. I know who's going to work out and who isn't inside the first conversation, usually. I'm good at it." He paused. "But I wasn't reading you that morning. I saw you, what you looked like, the dress, the boots, your—" He stopped. "And I made a decision before I listened to a word you said. That's not reading people. That's ignoring them. And a foreman who ignores people creates the kind of gaps that Reeves walked through." His voice was level, no self-pity in it, just a man accounting for something honestly. "I should have seen him sooner. I didn't. I think part of why I didn't is the same habit that made me dismiss you that morning, looking at what's on the surface and deciding it's the whole story." The kitchen was very quiet. "Caleb," Martha said. "I'm not finished," he said, not unkindly. She waited. "You saved this ranch," he said. "Not by yourself. You'd be the first person to say that, and you'd be right. But the thing that made all the rest of it possible was you, standing in my office on your first day, making me give you one dinner." He looked at her directly. "I was wrong about you, completely and in every way that matters. And I wanted to say that out loud, plainly, so you could hear it clearly." Martha looked at Caleb Thornton, the man who had laughed at her in that office, who had been certain she was something before she proved she was something else, who had managed his mistake without making excuses for it, and was standing in her kitchen right now doing the hardest thing most people never got around to doing. "I hear it," she said, "and I accept it." He nodded once. He settled the hat back on his head. "Good," he said. "Now, William says you're thinking about changing the Thursday supper rotation. I want to register a formal concern about anything that affects the current biscuit situation." Martha looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed, a real one, full, the kind she didn't always let out where people could see it. "The biscuits aren't going anywhere," she said. "That's all I needed," Caleb said, and walked out with something that, on a less weathered face, would have been a smile. The weeks that followed the settlement had their own particular quality, the quality of a place that has been through something and has come out holding and is still figuring out what that means. The rhythm of the ranch returned to what it must have been before the bad months, before Reeves and the empty pantry and the rotating cooks and the grinding low-level misery of men who couldn't trust what was being put in front of them. The work got done the way work got done when people felt steady, not perfectly, not without problems, but with the confidence of a crew that believed in the ground under their feet. Martha expanded the garden. This was not a dramatic event. She mentioned to Thomas that the south side of the kitchen had good light and the soil looked workable, and Thomas mentioned it to Caleb, and Caleb mentioned it to William, and William said, according to Thomas, who was present, "Whatever Martha needs." And the following Saturday, 3 of the hands spent the morning breaking ground on what would become, by the following spring, a proper kitchen garden with rows of herbs and beans and root vegetables that would cut the supply costs considerably and give the kitchen access to things she'd been making do without. Hector Briggs, who had no official role in the garden project, was nonetheless observed on the second Saturday pulling weeds in the herb section with the focused intensity of a man who is definitely not interested in gardening and just happened to be in the area. Martha did not mention this to anyone, but she started leaving the best of the fresh sage near his usual seat at the table. It was Thomas who noticed first that something had changed between Martha and William. Not because they were obvious about it, because they weren't, but because Thomas had the particular attentiveness of someone who cared about both of them, and was therefore watching with more precision than a casual observer. He mentioned it to Martha directly, in the kitchen, on a quiet afternoon, with the straightforwardness that had always been his best quality. "You and Mr. Carter," he said. Martha looked at him. "What about us?" "I'm not asking for details," Thomas said carefully. "I just want to know that it's—" He stopped. "That you're all right." She looked at him for a long moment. This young man, who had been the first one to treat her like someone worth being kind to, who had watched her work on that first day with something in his face that was trying to figure out who she really was instead of who she looked like, who had fetched the molasses without being asked twice and kept the fire stoked and reported what he heard without editorializing. And somewhere in the past 2 months had become someone she would have called, if pressed, a friend. "I'm all right," she said. "Better than all right." He nodded. His face did the complicated thing it did when he was managing a feeling he considered too large for the room. "Good," he said. He's a good man. He's been alone a long time. He deserves—" He stopped again. "You both deserve it," he said. Martha went back to her work before he could see what his words did to her face. "Go do something useful," she said, and he went, and she stood at the work table for a moment with her hands flat on the surface and breathed. The first time William had supper with her in the kitchen, not in the mess hall, not with the men, just the 2 of them at the small table she'd set near the window. It was a Thursday in October, 6 weeks after the settlement, and it was entirely unplanned in the way that the most important things usually are. The men had eaten. Thomas had cleared the tables and gone to the bunkhouse. The mess hall was empty and clean. Martha was finishing the last of the kitchen work when William appeared in the doorway with a lamp in one hand and a question in the way he was standing. "There's a plate left," she said, "if you want it." "I want it," he said, and came inside. She set the small table with what she had, 2 plates, 2 cups of coffee, the last of the cornbread, and the bean soup she'd been keeping warm on the back of the stove because she had a habit of making a little extra, and she had stopped pretending it wasn't for this. They sat across from each other at the small table by the window, with the lamp between them and the Montana dark outside, and the sounds of the ranch settling into its night quiet around them. And they talked. Not about the ranch, not about the settlement, Not about Whitmore or Reeves or Aldrich or any of the things that had occupied every serious conversation between them for the past 2 months. They talked about other things. William told her about his wife. Quietly, not painfully, the way a man talks about someone he has grieved properly and made a peace with. About how she had loved the south pasture in the spring when the grass came in, and how she had been a better judge of cattle than anyone else on the property, and how her family had built this ranch with their hands, and what it had meant to hold it after she was gone. Martha listened the way she always listened, fully, without rushing, without making it smaller. And when he was finished, she told him about her mother, about the kitchen in Missouri, where she had grown up, learning everything she knew, watching her mother's hands move through the work with the ease of someone for whom cooking was not a task, but a language. About the way her mother talked while she cooked, a continuous quiet narration of what she was doing and why, directed at whatever child happened to be nearby, as if she understood that what she was transmitting was too important to leave to chance. About the recipes written in her mother's handwriting, still folded in her coat pocket, the ink going faint in places, but the words still there. "Can I see them?" William asked. She looked at him. Nobody had ever asked to see them. In 20 years of carrying her mother's recipes across 6 counties and 3 territories, nobody had ever looked at that folded paper in her pocket and thought to ask. She reached into her coat. She had kept it on against the October evening, and took the folded paper out and spread it on the table between the plates and the lamp. William leaned forward and read. He read carefully, the way he read everything, with real attention, not the polite attention of someone waiting for it to be over. The paper was soft with handling, the folds deep and worn, the handwriting small and precise and slightly slanted to the right. "Your mother had beautiful handwriting," he said. "She said if you couldn't write it clearly, you didn't understand it clearly," Martha said. He looked at the recipes for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "She knew what she was doing," he said, "and she made sure you knew it too." "She did," Martha said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture he'd made the first time, holding the scarred hand, but this time with no performance of anything in it. Just a man and a woman at a small table with a lamp between them and their whole lives behind them, and whatever came next still to be determined. "I want you to know something," he said. She waited. "Whatever you want this to be," he said. "Whatever pace, whatever shape. I'm not in a hurry. I'm not going anywhere. And I'm not going to put any kind of pressure on you about what comes next." He held her gaze. "You came here with nothing, and you built something. That's yours. Whatever else happens or doesn't happen, that's yours. And I won't ever try to make it anything other than what it is." Martha looked at him for a long moment. "William," she said, "I spent 3 weeks walking across open Montana terrain in boots that were falling apart, looking for a place that needed what I had. I found it." She turned her hand over under his. "I found more than I was looking for. I know what I want this to be." He looked at her. "So do I," he said. Outside, the wind moved through the Montana grass, that big, indifferent western wind that didn't know or care about the small human arrangements being made in its shadow. And Silver Creek Ranch held its ground in the dark, the way it had held its ground for more than a decade, through drought and loss and betrayal, and the long-wearing work of keeping something alive. It was still standing. It was going to keep standing. The winter came early that year, the way Montana winters did. Not gradually, not with warning, but with the sudden decisive cold of a door slammed shut. The ranch adjusted. It always had. The men moved into the rhythms of cold weather work. The longer hours in the stable, the ice to be broken on the water troughs, the fences to be checked after the wind had its way with them overnight. The kitchen became the center of the ranch in a way that was even more literal in winter than it had been in the warmer months. The stove ran hot all day, and the warmth of it spread through the building. The way warmth does in cold climates, hungrily, gratefully, held onto by everyone within reach. Men found reasons to come through the kitchen that had nothing to do with food. They came for the warmth. They came for the particular quality of the room, which Martha had slowly made into something that was more than functional. There was a pot of coffee that was never empty on the back of the stove. there was usually something good cooling on the rack. And there was Martha herself, at the work table or the stove, or moving through the space with the efficiency of someone completely at home in what she was doing. And the men had learned, without anyone saying so, that the kitchen was a place where you could come and be steady for a moment. Hector Briggs came in one December morning, a bitter cold morning, the kind that made the air hurt on the way in, and stood by the stove and held his hands out toward it without saying anything. Martha poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the edge of the work table and went back to what she was doing, and he stood there warming his hands and drinking his coffee in silence for 10 minutes before he put the cup down and went back out. At the door he stopped. "Martha," he said. She looked up. He stood in the doorway with the cold air coming in around him and his hat pulled low and his weathered face doing something she had learned to read as the Hector Briggs version of emotional expression, which was approximately 1/8 the visible intensity of a normal person's, but twice as meaningful. "It's a good kitchen," he said. She looked at him steadily. "It's a good ranch," she said. Good kitchen was just waiting to catch up. Something moved in his face that, on another man, would have been a smile. He went back out into the cold. Martha went back to her bread. Spring came the way it always did in Montana, reluctant at first, then all at once, like a decision finally made. The kitchen garden. Thomas and the hands had broken ground on in the fall was ready to be planted, and Martha spent the better part of an April Saturday on her knees in the dirt, her hands in the soil, marking out the rows. It was not kitchen work. It was not the kind of thing she had thought of as her work before. But she had learned in the months at Silver Creek that the boundary between the kitchen and everything else was more permeable than she had believed, that cooking was only the center of what she was doing here and not the whole of it, and that the whole of it was bigger than she had known to want. William found her in the garden at mid-morning. He crouched down beside her without ceremony and looked at what she was doing, and then picked up the packet of sage seeds she'd set on the edge of the row and looked at it. "Where do these go?" he asked. She showed him. He planted them alongside her, not talking much, both of them working in the easy quiet of people who have been in the same space long enough that silence is comfortable. The spring sun was warm on their backs. The ranch moved around them in its ordinary way, voices, horses, the work that never stopped. After a while, William said, "Aldrich sent a letter." Martha kept working. "Good news or bad?" "Good," he said. "The final accounting came through, with the $720 from Whitmore and the costs we've recovered from the supply fraud, and what the kitchen has saved in the last 6 months." He paused. "The ranch is in the best financial position it's been in 4 years." Martha sat back on her heels. 4 years. Before his wife died. Before the slow unraveling that Whitmore had been patient enough to help along. Before the empty pantry and the rotating cooks and the men eating bad food and losing faith. "That's good news," she said. Aldrich also said. William stopped. He was quiet for a moment in the deliberate way of someone choosing carefully. He said he was glad to see the ranch in better hands. I told him it was the same hands it's always been in. He paused. He said he meant more hands, plural. Martha looked at him. He looked back at her with the directness that had been there from that first evening in the kitchen doorway, the quality that had made him different from the others, that had made him the one she had noticed, even on that first terrible day. "Martha," he said. "William," she said. "I've been thinking about asking you something for 3 months," he said. "I've been not asking it because I wanted to be sure, and because I didn't want to push, and because you came here with nothing. And I never wanted you to feel that what you've built here was contingent on anything except your own work." He held her gaze. "But I'm sure. And I think you are too. And I'd rather ask a direct question than spend another 3 months not asking it." The garden was quiet. The ranch moved around them. "Ask it," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. No decoration on it. No speech before it or qualification after. Just the question, plain and real, from a man who meant it the way he meant everything, completely. Martha looked at William Carter, at this man who had stood on his porch on the first day and not laughed, who had given her one dinner's chance and meant it, who had listened every time she spoke and acted on what she said, who had held her scarred hand and seen what it was, who had sat across a small table from her in October and asked to see her mother's recipes. And she thought about the 3 weeks of walking. She thought about every door that had closed. She thought about the morning she had stood at the gate of Silver Creek Ranch with aching feet and cracked boots and a cast-iron pan and made a decision to walk through. She thought about her mother. "You'll know the right place when you're in it, Martha girl. It won't be loud about it. It'll just feel like somewhere you can breathe." She had been breathing for months. "Yes," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the dirt-covered, seed-calloused, scarred and capable hand, and held it the way he always held it, like something worth holding. "Good," he said. That evening, Martha cooked supper the way she did every evening, fully, carefully, with the attention that was not a performance, but simply how she worked. And when the men came in, and the mess hall filled with the noise and warmth that had become the sound of Silver Creek Ranch being alive, she stood at the kitchen door for a moment and looked at it all. Thomas, moving through the tables with coffee, catching her eye and smiling the real smile of someone who already knew. Hector Briggs at the far end of the long table, eating the food she had made with the focused appreciation of a man who had learned, in the past 7 months, exactly what he had been missing. Big Jim, with his third piece of cornbread, as if the second had been merely preliminary. Caleb at the head of his section of the table, running things the way he ran things, steady, clear-eyed, no longer looking past what was right in front of him. And William at the middle of the table, the same place he always sat, not at the head, but in the middle, because that was the kind of man he was. He looked up and found her in the kitchen doorway. She looked back. Everything that needed to be said had been said, in the garden, with their hands in the soil, and everything that came before, that had been said in the kitchen and the office, and the small table by the window in October. And before that, it had been said in the act of showing up, on both their parts, and refusing to stop. The woman who had walked through the gate of Silver Creek Ranch with a cloth bag and a cast-iron pan, and her dead mother's recipes, and nothing else had become the woman this ranch was built around. Not because she had changed who she was, because she had refused to. She had walked into a room full of men who looked at her body and her clothes and her worn-down boots and decided they already knew her story. And she had told them a different one. Not with words, not with argument, not by demanding they see her differently, but by doing the work she had come to do, with the skill she had earned across 20 years of hard kitchens and harder roads, until the story they had decided on didn't fit anymore, and they had to let it go. She had fed them. She had really fed them. And in doing so, she had given back to Silver Creek Ranch something that no amount of money and no change in management and no legal victory could have given it on its own. The sense of itself as a place worth belonging to, a place worth defending, a place where a person could sit down at the end of a hard day and be certain that something good was waiting. That was what her mother had taught her in a kitchen in Missouri, watching her hands move through the work with the ease of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. That was what she had carried across 6 counties and 3 territories in a coat pocket folded small. That was what she had set down on Caleb Thornton's desk on the first day, when she put her pan on the table and said, "Give me one dinner," and looked him in the eyes and meant every word. The woman nobody wanted had become the woman nobody could replace. And Silver Creek Ranch, the ranch that had laughed when she walked through the gate, that had doubted her and underestimated her and looked past her and judged her before she ever opened her mouth. Silver Creek Ranch was hers. She had earned it with her hands. She had held it with her heart. And she was never, not for a single day of the rest of her long and full and beautiful life, going to let it go.